The salt air stung my eyes as red and blue lights painted the thick New Jersey fog. State troopers flanked my porch, guiding two figures down the wooden steps. My mother dug her designer heels into the wet gravel. She twisted around her silk coat, slipping off one shoulder, and glared at me with a hatred so pure it burned the cold air between us. "You are no daughter of mine!" she screamed, her voice tearing through the quiet coastal evening. I stood near the railing, my hands tucked deep into the pockets of my jacket, feeling the smooth, cold surface of a single vintage pearl against my thumb. I know I said my voice steady. I am Grandma's granddaughter. My father did not look at me. He just stared at the muddy ground as the steel cuffs clicked shut around his wrists. Before I explain how a rotting beach house managed to tear down a millionaire family, let me ask you a question. How old are you, and where are you watching from today? Drop your age and location in the comments, and welcome to Amanda Told Stories. If you have ever had to outsmart the people who were supposed to protect you, hit subscribe. You will want to hear every single detail of this. To understand the arrest, we have to go back 6 months to a polished mahogany table in a sterile Newark law office. The reading of a will strips away polite society and shows you exactly what people are made of. I sat at the far end of the room, keeping my posture straight. As a supply chain logistics manager, my job is to optimize routes, identify deficits, and anticipate systemic failures. I applied that exact same logic to my own family. My father Edward sat across from me. He checked his platinum watch every 3 minutes, his knee bouncing in a rapid, nervous rhythm against the table leg. Beside him, my mother Patricia traced a manicured finger along the rim of a paper coffee cup, acting as though the firm had insulted her bloodline by not serving bone china. Then there was my sister Melanie. She spent the entire meeting scrolling on her phone, sighing aloud whenever the attorney turned a page. Resting against her collarbone was a string of vintage pearls. My grandmother's pearls. They looked unusually heavy, holding a dull, milky luster under the harsh fluorescent lights. Melanie had walked into Grandma's bedroom the morning of the funeral and claimed them wearing them with a black slip dress, like she was attending a fashion gala. The attorney, an older man with wire-rimmed glasses, cleared his throat. He produced a document that looked unnervingly crisp and new. "This is the final testament, updated 3 weeks prior to her passing," he read. I pressed my fingernails into my palms until they stung. My grandmother's mind had been clouded by heavy medication in her final month. The idea of her drafting a coherent legal document during that haze defied basic logic. The terms were swift. The liquid assets totaling $1.2 million from the sale of her former pharmaceutical holdings went directly to Edward and Patricia. Melanie was granted the jewelry collection and a trust designated for living expenses. The attorney paused. He ran a finger down the page, then glanced over his glasses at me. "And to Andrea Gill, the coastal property located in Ocean County, along with all associated tax burdens and physical liabilities." A heavy silence settled over the room. Only the hum of the air conditioner filled the space. My mother covered her mouth, pretending to scratch her nose to hide a smirk. Melanie did not bother hiding anything. She let out a sharp little laugh, not even looking up from her screen. The Ocean County property was a notorious family joke. It was a decaying structure, sitting on prime shoreline, crippled by water intrusion, a failing roof, and a crushing stack of unpaid property taxes. The township had been threatening condemnation for 3 years. From a logistical standpoint, it was a deficit. It was a financial anchor designed to sink whoever held the deed. "If the property is too much of a burden, Andrea," my father offered. His tone dripped with fake sympathy. "You could always refuse the inheritance. Let the state foreclose." I studied the rigid set of his jaw, the eager, hungry glint in his eyes. He wanted me to walk away. My entire childhood had been a masterclass in giving up space for my sister absorbing the blame to keep the peace and accepting whatever scraps fell from the table. But I also remembered the summers spent on that porch. I remembered my grandmother handing me a trowel, showing me how to plant hydrangeas to hold the sandy soil together when the coastal winds blew hard. I reached across the table and took the heavy silver pen from the attorney's desk. I accept. My mother dropped her hand, her expression hardening. Do not be stubborn, Andrea. You do not have the capital to fix that disaster. Your credit will be ruined. My credit is fine, I said, pressing the pen to the paper. The ink flowed smooth and black. I will manage. My goal was straightforward. Secure the deed, hire a crew to gut the toxic drywall, renovate the structure just enough to pass municipal inspection, and sell it to clear the tax debt. A simple input and output equation. 2 days later, I drove down the Garden State Parkway, the concrete skyline dissolved into flat marshlands and toll booths, until the sharp, salty air filled the cabin of my car. I pulled into the overgrown driveway of the shore house. The structure leaned slightly, the white paint peeled away from the wood like sunburned skin. The air inside smelled of damp earth and old cedar. I hired Hector Reyes, a local contractor I had vetted through 3 different commercial channels. Hector possessed a reputation for strict honesty and fair pricing. It is rough, Miss Gill, he noted, walking the perimeter with a clipboard, kicking a piece of rotting siding. Water damage in the foundation. The master bedroom walls are spongy. We will have to tear it down to the studs just to see what is salvageable. Start tomorrow, I instructed, handing him the brass key. Keep a strict ledger. Whatever you find, document it. Over the next week, the renovation consumed my evenings. During the day, I audited pharmaceutical shipping manifests for my employer. At night, I balanced Hector's material invoices on my kitchen counter. The silence from my family should have been a relief, but instead it morphed into targeted harassment. Patricia began calling my office line. I drove past the lot today. Her voice crackled through the receiver one Tuesday afternoon. It looks like a landfill, Andrea. The neighbors are complaining. Why do you not just let us take it off your hands? We can pay the back taxes and bulldoze it. The township has not cited me, I replied, typing data into my spreadsheet. The renovation is on schedule. You are being ridiculous, and Melanie says you took a jewelry box from the estate. She is missing a brooch. I took nothing. Melanie has the pearls. That is all Grandma ever wore. Just drop the deed, Andrea, before you embarrass yourself. The line went dead. I set the phone down. A tight knot formed in my stomach. Why the sudden interest? Why the pressure to surrender a property they had mocked days prior? In supply chain management, when a party applies disproportionate pressure to acquire a defective asset, it means the asset holds hidden value. The answer arrived on a Thursday morning. Rain lashed against my office window in thick gray sheets blurring the city below. My desk phone illuminated. It was not my mother. The caller ID displayed Hector's number. I picked up the receiver, wedging it between my ear and shoulder. Hector are the tarps holding up to the storm. Miss Gill, his voice was tight, stripped of its usual steady cadence. The sound of static and heavy footsteps echoed in the background. You need to get down here. Did the roof cave? No. A long pause stretched over the line. I could hear the wind howling through the open frame of the house. We opened up the drywall in the master bedroom. We found something. Found what? Ma'am, I did not know what to do. I had to call it in. Hector lowered his voice to a hushed, urgent whisper. Come here right now, but whatever you do, do not tell your parents or your sister. The police are already swarming the property. Rain slicked the asphalt of the Garden State Parkway as I pushed my sedan 10 miles over the speed limit. The windshield wipers beat a rapid, relentless rhythm, but my pulse hammered faster. My mind sorted through a dozen logical scenarios. Structural collapse, squatter occupation, unexploded ordnance from the coastal defense era washing ashore. None of those variables accounted for Hector sounding genuinely terrified. By the time I turned onto the gravel shoulder of Ocean Avenue, the flashing lights cut through the afternoon gloom. Two local cruisers sat angled across my driveway. Thick yellow tape stretched across the wooden porch pillars, snapping wildly in the coastal wind. I parked halfway on the grass and killed the engine. The rain had slowed to a miserable drizzle, soaking the shoulders of my blazer before I even reached the front steps. A uniformed officer raised a hand to halt me, but Hector appeared in the doorway. His work boots were coated in white plaster dust. He nodded to the cop, gesturing that I was the property owner. Hector did not speak as I ducked under the tape. He merely turned and led me down the narrow hallway toward the master bedroom. The house smelled of damp rot, exposed pine, and the sharp tang of copper. When we reached the bedroom, the scope of the demolition became clear. Hector had torn the drywall down to the studs along the far side, exposing the skeletal framework of the house. Resting in the center of the warped floorboards was a dark gray metal lockbox. It was heavy industrial and covered in a thick layer of insulation debris. The lid sat open, forced backward with a steel crowbar. A detective stood over the box, snapping photos with a digital camera. The flash illuminated the dark corners of the room. He glanced up as I stepped over a pile of broken sheetrock. I looked past the detective and stared into the open container. My breath caught in my throat. Inside, neatly stacked and wrapped in tight rubber bands, were thick bricks of $100 bills. The paper looked old, the ink slightly faded, but the sheer volume was undeniable. Tucked beside the currency were 3 dark blue passports. I leaned closer, squinting at the open page of the top booklet. The photo belonged to my father, Edward, but the printed name read Thomas Vance. A sudden wave of nausea hit my stomach. I had calculated every possible structural defect this property could hide, but I had never planned for a hidden vault. "You are the homeowner?" the detective asked. His tone was flat, devoid of any warmth or empathy. He held a small spiral notebook in one hand, studying me with the distinct gaze of someone trying to spot a liar. "I signed the deed less than 10 days ago," I answered, fighting to keep my voice level. "I hired Mr. Reyes to gut the water damage so the structure could pass municipal inspection. This is the first time I have stepped foot in this room since my grandmother died." The detective wrote a line in his pad. "We are looking at roughly $400,000 in untraceable cash, Ms. Gill, along with federal identification documents that appear forged. People do not usually abandon nearly $500,000 by accident. Your grandmother owned this property for 30 years. Are you telling me she hid this, or are you telling me you knew it was here and sent a demolition crew in to retrieve the package?" I stared at the dusty bundles of currency. A memory surfaced, sharp and vivid. I was 14, sitting on these same porch steps, holding a glass of iced tea while Grandma scraped peeling paint from the window frames. She had paused, wiping sweat from her forehead, and tapped the wooden siding with the handle of her putty knife. "A strong house is not about the paint, Andrea," she had said, her eyes fixed on the gray horizon. "It is about what is hidden in the walls." I had spent years thinking she meant character. I thought it was a poetic metaphor for human resilience. Looking at the open lockbox, the literal truth hit me like a physical blow. She meant exactly what she said. I had zero knowledge of this, I told the detective, meeting his dark gaze directly without blinking. "I work in supply chain logistics. If I wanted to quietly extract hidden funds, I would not have hired a licensed bonded contractor to smash the walls with a sledgehammer in broad daylight and alert the authorities." The logic landed perfectly. The detective paused, processing my rationale. Before he could formulate another question, the screech of expensive tires echoed from the street. I turned toward the front window. A pristine white Range Rover had mounted the curb, parking illegally across the neighbor's soggy lawn. My sister threw open the driver door. Melanie wore a silk trench coat and stiletto boots sinking deep into the wet mud with every furious step she took toward the porch. "What is going on here?" Melanie demanded, her shrill voice carrying over the wind. "A neighbor called Mom and said the police were raiding the dump." She ducked under the yellow tape, marching straight toward the front door. I moved fast. I left the bedroom, sprinting down the hallway to intercept her. I stepped into the doorframe, planting my feet firmly to block her path, just as she reached the threshold. "You cannot come inside," I said, crossing my arms. "Move, Andrea," Melanie snapped, trying to shove past my shoulder. "What did you do? Are you running a meth lab in this rotting pile of garbage? I knew you were desperate for cash, but this is pathetic." My mind worked frantically. If Melanie saw the cash, or worse, the fake passports bearing our parents' faces, the information would reach Edward and Patricia before the police even logged the evidence bags. I looked her dead in the eye and delivered the first logical fabrication I could construct. "Hector found friable asbestos in the drywall," I lied, keeping my facial expression entirely rigid. "The police brought an environmental inspector. The fibers are airborne, Melanie. If you walk in here breathing without a respirator, you will be coughing up blood by Christmas." Melanie froze, her eyes widened, darting toward the dark hallway behind me. Her vanity won the battle against her curiosity. She took a swift step backward, pulling her silk collar up to cover her nose and mouth. "You are unbelievable," she muttered, her voice muffled by the expensive fabric. "Mom was right. You should have let the state bulldoze this toxic trap. Now you are going to get us all sued by the township for contamination." She spun around on her ruined heels, marching back to her luxury SUV. I watched her slam the door and speed away, leaving deep tire ruts in the grass. Only when her taillights disappeared around the corner did I finally exhale. The air in my lungs felt like shattered glass. Behind me, the detective and two uniformed officers carried the lockbox out of the bedroom. They placed the metal container into thick evidence bags. "We will be in touch, Ms. Gill," the detective stated, brushing past me on his way out the door. "The property is clear for now, but do not leave the state." I stood in the empty hallway, listening to the heavy cruisers pull away. The silence of the house settled around me, heavier and darker than before. Hector walked out of the bedroom. He pulled off his leather work gloves, slapping them against his thigh to shake off the plaster dust. He looked toward the front door, ensuring the street was empty, then stepped close to me. "I did not show them everything," Hector whispered. He reached inside his canvas tool belt and pulled out a thick, legal-sized envelope. It was coated in a gray layer of insulation dust, the edges yellowed with age and humidity. "It fell down behind the floor joist when I pulled the metal box out," he explained, handing the package to me. "The cops only saw the shiny lockbox. They did not look down into the cavity." I took the envelope. It carried a strange weight, much heavier than standard paper. My name was written across the front in Grandma's unmistakable looping cursive. My pulse resumed its frantic hammering. The $400,000 in the lockbox was a substantial sum, but the sloppy inclusion of the passports felt wrong. Grandma was meticulous. She would never leave loose ends unless she wanted them found. The lockbox was bait. It was a calculated distraction designed to occupy whoever came tearing through the walls first. The money was merely a decoy for the greedy. The actual truth, the dangerous secret she had left behind, was resting right in my hands. I locked the doors of my sedan. The interior felt like a pressurized cabin, sealing me away from the damp coastal air and the flashing lights receding down the street. Rain drummed a steady, hypnotic rhythm against the roof. The envelope rested heavily in my lap. I wiped the gritty plaster dust from my fingers onto the fabric of my slacks and slid my thumb under the sealed flap. The heavy paper tore with a dry, sharp sound that echoed in the quiet car. Inside were two folded documents. The first was a single sheet of thick ivory stationery. The second was a dense packet bound with a brass staple bearing the raised seal of a licensed notary public. I unfolded the stationery first. The handwriting was immaculate, sweeping across the page in dark blue ink. "My dear Andrea," the letter began. "If you are reading this, it means you accepted the shore house, and you found Hector. I always knew you were the only one smart enough to look past the rot." I read the next paragraph, and the air left my lungs. My grandmother outlined the exact truth behind the collapse of her former pharmaceutical logistics company. For 5 years, Edward and Patricia had systematically skimmed profits off the top of the corporate accounts. They falsified shipping manifests, manipulated vendor invoices, and funneled the diverted capital into untraceable offshore holdings. My parents were not brilliant venture capitalists. They were common thieves, wearing designer suits, stealing from their own blood. Sitting in the driver's seat, the puzzle pieces of my childhood rapidly snapped into place. Edward never actually worked. He spent his days on golf courses bragging about investment portfolios that did not exist. Patricia hosted lavish charity galas, purchasing social status with money she had quietly drained from her own mother. Their entire existence was a carefully constructed mirage. But my grandmother was not a foolish woman. She had built a supply chain empire in a ruthless industry. She knew exactly what they were doing. Instead of confronting them, she played a long, silent game of financial chess. The next few sentences of the letter contained a revelation that made my hands shake. To punish them, Grandma had purposefully restructured her corporate holdings before she sold the company. The $1.2 million my parents inherited at the law office was not a liquid cash account. It was a highly complex corporate asset class. Grandma had legally attached a monumental deferred federal tax liability to that specific portfolio. For decades, the pharmaceutical company had deferred capital gains taxes on a block of commercial real estate. By unspooling the corporate protection, Grandma tied that crushing tax burden directly to the exact asset bundle my parents gleefully claimed at the will reading. By signing that crisp, fake will, Edward and Patricia did not inherit a fortune. They voluntarily adopted over $3 million in IRS debt. They had signed their own financial execution warrant. The federal government would not care about their country club memberships or their leased luxury cars. The IRS would come to collect, and they would seize everything. My parents had inherited a ticking time bomb, and they had smiled while the attorney handed them the detonator. I looked through my rain-streaked window at the sagging porch of the shore house. I thought about the heavy metal lockbox the police had carried away. The letter explained that detail as well. The cash in the drywall was bait, Andrea. Edward is a greedy, impatient man. I knew he would eventually tear those walls apart looking for scraps. Let the local police have the cash. It will keep Edward occupied defending himself while you secure the real legacy. The true will is attached. I lowered the letter, staring blindly at the dashboard. The sheer brilliance of her trap left me speechless. She had mathematically dismantled her abusers from beyond the grave. The $400,000 hidden in the master bedroom was just cheese in a mousetrap. It was a calculated distraction, designed to trigger an investigation and tie up my father in local legal trouble, blinding him to the federal disaster looming on his horizon. I started the engine, the heater blasting warm air against my freezing hands. I needed legal armor, and I needed it immediately. The next morning, I drove into downtown Newark. I bypassed the polite, mahogany-paneled firms and walked into the sterile, glass-walled office of Valerie Quinn. Valerie was a corporate litigator known for carving up fraudulent executives in civil court. She did not serve coffee in fine china. She drank black espresso from a paper cup and treated the law like a contact sport. Valerie sat behind a wide steel desk, wearing a sharp charcoal blazer. She spent 20 minutes reviewing the true will I had placed in front of her. The silence in the room was dense, broken only by the sound of her turning the heavy pages. "This document is airtight," Valerie finally stated, tracing the notary stamp with the cap of her pen. "Your grandmother executed this 5 weeks before she passed. Furthermore, it contains a specific revocation clause, making the forged version your parents hold entirely void. This legally grants you sole control of the remaining estate, including the true offshore trust she established before the company sold." "Can we file it today?" I asked, leaning forward in the leather guest chair. Valerie lowered her pen, locking her dark eyes onto mine. "Filing this is not a simple administrative task, Andrea." She rested her elbows on the desk, interlacing her fingers. "Your parents are about to receive an astronomical tax bill. The IRS automated system will generate the deficiency notice within the week. When they realize the inheritance is poisoned, they will panic. They will desperately search for a way out, and the moment I file this document with the probate court, it becomes public record. They will realize you hold the true keys to the kingdom." "I understand the mechanics," I said, keeping my voice level. "Do you understand the consequences?" Valerie challenged, her tone turning razor sharp. "Authenticating this true will means total war. You are stripping away their only remaining asset. Desperate people do not fight fair. They will use every resource they have left to destroy your credibility, your career, and your sanity. They will try to break you before a judge can rule on the authenticity of this document." I looked out Valerie's window at the Newark skyline. I thought about the decades I spent shrinking myself to make my sister comfortable. I thought about my father mocking the shore house, eager to watch me fail. My parents' wealth was a complete illusion, held together by stolen funds and boundless arrogance. They had never faced a consequence in their lives because everyone around them was too afraid to hold them accountable. "File it," I instructed, holding Valerie's gaze without blinking. "I want them to know exactly who beat them." Valerie smiled. It was a dangerous, thrilling expression. "Consider it done. But keep your head on a swivel, Andrea. Your father is going to realize he needs liquid capital to fight the federal government. He is going to remember that decaying house on the coast, and he is going to come looking for the rest of the money he assumes is hiding behind the drywall." The reality of her warning settled over me as I rode the elevator down to the street. The timeline was rapidly accelerating. Edward was about to open his mail and discover he was a ruined man. The shore house was no longer just a renovation project. It was about to become ground zero for a hostile invasion. The timeline accelerated much faster than even Valerie had predicted. 3 days after my visit to the corporate litigator in Newark, the automated gears of the federal government began to grind. I sat at my logistics terminal, analyzing freight routes for a major client, when a digital notification flashed across my phone screen. It was a motion alert from the temporary security camera I had instructed Hector to install on the front porch of the shore house. I tapped the video feed. A black luxury sedan sat parked on the ruined front lawn, crushing the damp grass. The heavy oak front door of my property was wide open, swinging slightly in the coastal breeze. I immediately dialed the local precinct. I reported a break in progress and requested patrol units to secure the perimeter. Then I grabbed my coat, bypassed the elevators, and took the stairs down to the parking garage. During the 40-minute drive down the Garden State Parkway, my mind ran through the cold mathematics of a home invasion. If ordinary criminals were targeting the house for remaining cash, they would strike under the cover of darkness. A daytime intrusion meant arrogance. It meant someone who firmly believed they had a right to be there. When I pulled onto Ocean Avenue, the familiar red and blue lights were already flashing against the overcast sky. 2 local officers stood on my porch. But they did not have their weapons drawn. They were not making arrests or clearing the rooms. They were simply standing there looking remarkably bored. I parked my car on the street and rushed across the soggy lawn. "I own this property," I stated, retrieving my driver license from my wallet and presenting it to the nearest officer. I called in the intrusion. Why are the suspects not in handcuffs? The older officer sighed and handed my license back. He shifted his weight, looking distinctly uncomfortable. It is not an intrusion, Ms. Gill. The gentleman inside provided documentation proving he holds a vested financial interest in the property. That is impossible, I said. I kept my voice perfectly flat, despite the surge of adrenaline flooding my system. I hold the sole deed. The officer pulled a folded piece of paper from his chest pocket and unfolded it. He claims you hired his contracting firm to manage the renovations, and you failed to pay the initial invoice. He filed a mechanics lien against the property 2 weeks ago. By law, he has a right to secure the premises and evaluate the materials until the debt is settled. I took the paper from his hand. It was a photocopy of a standard contractor lien, complete with a signature that looked remarkably like mine. The document was backdated to the exact afternoon the fake will was read in Newark. Edward had not just driven down here in a blind panic. He had engineered a legal loophole. He knew the local police were terrified of getting involved in complicated property disputes. By presenting a forged lien, he transformed a criminal breaking and entering charge into a civil disagreement. This is a forgery, I told the officer, handing the paper back. I never signed this document. That may be true, the officer replied, but we cannot prove forgery on a front porch. You will have to take it up with a judge. Until a court officially voids this lien, our hands are tied. We cannot remove him. It is a civil matter. The officers tipped their hats and walked back to their cruisers. I stood on the damp grass and watched them drive away, taking my immediate protection with them. My father had successfully neutralized law enforcement. He was inside my house, and I was entirely on my own. I walked up the wooden steps. The front door was splintered near the deadbolt. Edward had not bothered to pick the lock. He had simply kicked it open. I stepped into the hallway. The smell of wet earth and ancient pine hung thick in the cold air. From the living room, the jarring sound of tearing wood echoed off the bare drywall. I turned the corner and froze in the doorway. The living room was a disaster zone. The original hardwood floors, which Hector had carefully preserved, were being systematically destroyed. Edward stood in the center of the room. He wielded a heavy steel crowbar, driving the wedged end under the floorboards and ripping them upward with frantic, uncoordinated strength. Sweat soaked the collar of his expensive dress shirt. His breathing was ragged-sounding, like a cornered animal hunting for a scrap of food. Standing near the brick fireplace, safely away from the flying wooden debris, was Patricia. She wore a tailored cashmere coat and held a disposable coffee cup, looking completely detached from the chaos around her. She noticed me first. "Oh, good, you are here," Patricia said. Her voice carried the casual, breezy tone of a woman hosting a Sunday brunch. "We decided to drive down and help you renovate. You clearly bit off more than you can chew with this awful place." I stared at her, absorbing the sheer magnitude of the manipulation. Edward drove the crowbar into another plank, splintering the aged oak with a loud crack. He tossed the broken wood aside, his eyes scanning the dark, dusty cavity beneath the floor. The IRS deficiency notice had arrived. The panic had set in. He firmly believed the funds the police confiscated earlier were only a fraction of the hidden wealth. He was tearing my house apart, searching for a lifeline to save himself from federal ruin. "Get out of my house," I said. My voice echoed off the barren walls. Edward stopped. He dropped the crowbar. The heavy steel clattered against the ruined floor. He stood up straight and turned to face me. His face was flushed red, his eyes bloodshot and erratic. For a man who had spent his entire life projecting the image of a refined aristocrat, he looked utterly unhinged. As he wiped the sweat from his forehead with the back of his hand, his left wrist caught the gray light spilling through the window. My gaze locked onto his forearm. The platinum luxury watch was gone. Edward had worn that specific timepiece every single day for a decade. It was his ultimate status symbol, a piece of intricate machinery worth more than most vehicles. The bare skin on his wrist was pale, leaving a distinct tan line where the heavy metal band used to rest. He had pawned it. The financial collapse was not approaching, it had already breached his gates. "I am not going anywhere," Edward sneered, stepping over the piles of shattered wood toward me. "You owe us, Andrea. We raised you. We put a roof over your head. You are not keeping this property for yourself." "I owe you nothing," I replied, refusing to take a single step backward. "You broke in, using a forged document." Edward let out a harsh, breathless laugh. "Prove it. I will drag you through the county civil court for the next 10 years. I will file motion after motion until you are bankrupt paying legal fees. I will tie this property up in so much litigation that the township will seize it just to stop the paperwork. You will never see a single dime from this sale." He was using the legal system as a blunt instrument, relying on the classic strategy of wealthy predators: exhaust the victim until they surrender. But he did not know I had already filed the true will in Newark. He did not know his remaining wealth was a toxic illusion. "Sign the deed over to me right now," Edward demanded, pointing a trembling finger at my chest. "Sign it over and I will dismiss the lien. You can go back to your quiet little corporate life and pretend none of this happened." I looked at the destroyed floorboards. I looked at the man who had spent my entire childhood demanding absolute obedience. He expected me to fold. He expected the quiet, agreeable daughter to shrink under the weight of his towering anger. I reached into my pocket and pulled out my phone, opening the video recording application. "I am giving you precisely 60 seconds to vacate my property before I hire a private security firm to physically remove you," I said. The words tasted like cold steel. "I will not sign anything. I will not negotiate. And if you ever forge my signature again, I will bypass the local precinct and hand the document directly to the district attorney for felony fraud." Edward stared at me. The color drained from his flushed face, replaced by a dark, dangerous malice. He opened his mouth to shout, but Patricia stepped forward. She placed a gloved hand on his arm, silencing him. She evaluated my rigid posture, recognizing that the old tactics of intimidation were no longer effective. The dynamic had fundamentally shifted, and she hated it. "Let us go, Edward," Patricia said, her voice dropping to a harsh whisper. "She is a lost cause." Edward picked up his suit jacket from the windowsill. He marched past me, intentionally bumping his shoulder hard against mine. I did not flinch. I absorbed the impact without moving a single inch. Patricia followed him toward the hallway. She paused at the threshold, turning to look back at me. Her polished facade had melted away, revealing the cold, calculating woman beneath. "You think you are so clever," Andrea Patricia said. The temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. "But you have no idea how the real world operates. You want to play hardball with your own family? Fine. You brought this on yourself." She turned and walked out, her heels clicking sharply against the splintered wood. I stood alone in the ruined living room, listening to their sedan start and speed away down the street. The physical invasion was over, but the true siege was just beginning. My mother had not made a hollow threat. I had successfully defended the physical perimeter of the shore house, but I had entirely forgotten to protect my digital borders. Patricia made a promise, and my family executed it with terrifying efficiency. The attack did not begin with another physical confrontation. It started quietly, infiltrating my life through glowing screens and whispered rumors. 2 days after my father destroyed my living room floorboards, my phone began vibrating continuously on my desk. I ignored the first dozen notifications, assuming they were automated system alerts from my freight tracking software. But the buzzing grew frantic. I finally unlocked the screen and found a flood of direct messages from people I had not spoken to in years. Former high school classmates, distant relatives, and family acquaintances were filling my inbox with vitriol. I opened a social media application and found the source of the firestorm. Melanie had launched a highly coordinated viral defamation campaign across her extensive network. My younger sister had spent her entire adult life curating a flawless digital persona. She cultivated an audience of thousands who hung on her every recommendation for luxury skincare and boutique fitness classes. Now she aimed that loyal audience directly at my throat. She posted a tearful, professionally lit video. In the footage, she wore minimal makeup and a simple beige sweater, playing the role of a devastated, heartbroken sibling. Melanie looked directly into the camera lens and told a fabricated story of elder abuse. She claimed I had spent the last 6 months of our grandmother's life isolating the elderly woman from the rest of the family. My sister spun a tale where I manipulated a dying, medicated widow into signing over her only remaining real estate asset. Melanie wept on screen, begging her followers to pray for our parents, who were allegedly drained of their life savings, trying to save the matriarch from my toxic influence. The video had already amassed tens of thousands of views. The comment section was a swamp of venomous strangers calling for my arrest. In a civilized world, internet gossip remains confined to digital echo chambers. But the elite social circles of New Jersey are small, interconnected webs of wealth and corporate influence. By Thursday afternoon, the scandal breached the glass walls of my logistics firm. My department director, a rigid man who prized corporate reputation above human decency, summoned me into his corner office. He did not offer me a seat. He simply turned his monitor around to display a local blog that had aggregated Melanie's video. "We handle sensitive government shipping contracts," Andrea, the director, stated. His tone was devoid of any professional warmth. "I have board members asking why one of my top supply chain managers is currently the subject of a viral elder exploitation scandal." I stood perfectly still, maintaining my composure. "The claims are entirely false," I explained calmly. "It is a fabricated retaliation tactic regarding an inheritance dispute. I possess legal documentation proving my sole ownership of the property." The director shook his head, looking out the window at the sprawling port facility. "Corporate does not care about truth. They care about optics. Until this situation is fully resolved and your name is cleared from the public domain, you are a liability. Effective immediately, you are placed on administrative leave. It is an unpaid suspension pending an internal review. Hand your security badge to Human Resources on your way out the door." Losing my primary income was a devastating strike, but I am a strategist. I walked out of the building calculating my survival timeline. I had enough liquid capital in my personal checking and savings accounts to sustain my basic needs and fund Hector for another 3 weeks. I sat in my parked sedan and opened my mobile banking application to transfer funds for my upcoming rent payment. The loading screen spun for a fraction of a second before displaying my balances. Checking balance, 0. Savings balance, 0. A wave of ice-cold terror washed over my entire body. I stared at the screen, refusing to believe the bold numbers. I refreshed the application 3 times. The result remained identical. Every single dollar I had earned, saved, and meticulously managed over the past 10 years was gone. I immediately called the banking institution fraud department. The customer service representative placed me on a brief hold, returning with information that shattered my reality. The funds were not stolen by an anonymous foreign hacker. The transfer was authorized in person at a physical branch located in Trenton. The representative explained that a woman, matching my physical description, presented my valid state identification card and correctly answered all verbal security questions. She requested a total account closure and walked out with a cashier check for the entire balance. The puzzle snapped together with sickening clarity. 4 years ago, Melanie and I had briefly shared an apartment. During that time, I ordered a duplicate identification card because I thought I lost my original. I found the original a week later. I never realized the duplicate went missing. Melanie had kept it. My sister had weaponized my own identity against me, answering security questions she knew by heart because we shared the same childhood. I begged the fraud department to freeze the cashier check, but they informed me the investigation process would take a minimum of 90 days. They treated me like a suspect rather than a victim. I hung up the phone, completely destitute. I had zero cash, zero income, and zero access to credit because Patricia and Edward had previously co-signed my apartment lease when I was a recent college graduate. I drove back to my urban apartment complex, hoping to buy myself a few days to formulate a plan. When I arrived at my building, the property manager was waiting in the lobby, accompanied by a private security guard. Edward had struck his final blow. Using his status as the primary guarantor on the lease, my father had contacted the management company that morning. He claimed I was engaged in illicit activities and officially withdrew his financial backing. The property manager, eager to appease a wealthy guarantor and avoid a scandal, handed me a formal notice to vacate the premises within 24 hours due to a breach of contract. I had no money to hire a lawyer to fight the illegal eviction. I had no money to rent a moving truck. I had no money to buy a hotel room. I spent the night packing my essential clothing, a few personal items, and my laptop into the trunk of my car. I left the furniture and the life I had built behind. Driving through the darkness toward the coast, the magnitude of my family's cruelty settled heavy on my chest. They did not just want the real estate. They wanted to erase my independence. They wanted to starve me until I came crawling back on my knees, begging for their mercy and offering the deed as an apology. I arrived at the shore property slightly past midnight. The coastal air had turned bitter and damp. Inside the structure was a hollow skeleton of exposed pine studs and torn flooring. There was no heating system, no hot water, and no electricity in the main living areas. I dragged a cheap foam mattress from my car trunk and laid it out on the dusty floorboards of the gutted master bedroom, the same room where the police had dragged away the decoy lockbox. I wrapped myself in 2 winter coats, shivering uncontrollably as the ocean wind howled through the gaps in the window framing. The physical cold was agonizing, but the psychological isolation was absolute. I was completely alone in a dark, decaying shell of a building. My phone was dead, my bank accounts were empty, my career was suspended. The people who shared my blood had systematically destroyed my entire existence in less than a week. The sheer exhaustion threatened to pull me under, into a deep, paralyzing despair. I reached into the inner pocket of my coat and pulled out the thick, ivory stationery. I could not see the blue ink in the pitch-black room, but I knew my grandmother's words by heart. I gripped the letter tightly in my freezing hands. Tears pricked my eyes, born from a potent mixture of grief and exhaustion, but I refused to let them fall. As I lay in the freezing dark, the overwhelming sadness began to harden. The grief crystallized into something entirely different. It turned into cold, calculating resolve. My parents thought they had broken a fragile daughter. They forgot they had forged a meticulous supply chain manager. They had taken my comfort, but they had left me with the only asset that truly mattered. I knew the truth, and I knew how to read a ledger. My defense was officially over. Tomorrow, I would begin the offensive. Edward would not stop hunting for the phantom cash he believed was still buried on the premises. His greed was a predictable algorithm. I just needed to lay the right digital trap to catch him in the act. Morning light sliced through the exposed wall studs, hitting my face like a physical strike. I woke up shivering on the thin foam mattress. My bones ached from the hard floor and the freezing coastal draft. I sat up, pulling my 2 winter coats tighter around my chest. The shore house was quiet save for the rhythmic crashing of the ocean waves a few blocks away. I survived the darkest night of my life. I was still breathing. The crunch of heavy tires on the gravel driveway signaled Hector arriving for the day. I stood up, smoothing the wrinkles out of my slacks, trying to maintain some semblance of professional dignity. Hector walked through the shattered front door frame, carrying 2 steaming paper cups. He stopped when he saw me standing in the gutted living room, surrounded by my meager belongings. He did not offer pity. He simply handed me a cup of black coffee. The heat radiating through the cardboard felt like a lifeline. "I need to run a portable generator today," Hector said, his voice unusually low. "But before we start making noise, we need to talk." He reached into his heavy canvas jacket and retrieved a small, digital voice recorder. He set it down on a stack of drywall sheets. Hector explained that his parents had immigrated to New Jersey with nothing, fleeing systemic corruption in their home country. He had spent 2 decades building his contracting firm on a foundation of absolute transparency. Reputation was his most valuable currency. My father did not understand that kind of currency. Edward only understood cash. "Your father tracked me down at the lumber supply yard yesterday evening," Hector explained, crossing his arms over his chest. "He cornered me near the loading docks. He assumed because I wear work boots and drive an old truck I would be easily compromised. He offered me $50,000 in cash to leave the back door unlocked tonight and turn a blind eye while he searched the rest of the property." My grip tightened around the coffee cup. Edward was escalating. The IRS deficiency notice was clearly tightening a noose around his neck. He was desperate to find the remaining fortune he believed Grandma had hidden in the framing. "I told him I needed to think about it," Hector continued. "But I had my hand in my pocket the entire time. I pressed record the second he mentioned your name." Hector tapped the play button on the small device. The tinny, compressed audio filled the dusty room. I heard the distant hum of a forklift, followed by my father speaking. His tone was dripping with that familiar, arrogant condescension. "She is just a stubborn girl throwing a tantrum," Edward said through the speaker. "I am the true owner of this estate. There is a fortune buried in those walls, Hector. Just leave the deadbolt undone. You walk away with 50 grand clean, and my ungrateful daughter learns a valuable lesson about the real world. No one gets hurt." I listened to the recording twice. Every syllable dripped with entitlement. Hearing his voice plotting against me in the shadows did not induce fear. It provoked a sharp, clinical clarity. The ping-pong dynamic of our relationship was officially dead. I was done reacting to their emotional abuse. I was done playing defense against their coordinated strikes. I was going to systematically dismantle their entire operation brick by brick. "I need internet access," I told Hector, handing him back the recorder, "and I need the generator running right now." Hector nodded, sensing the shift in my posture. 10 minutes later, the dull roar of the gas generator echoed from the backyard. An extension cord snaked through the hallway, powering my laptop. I sat cross-legged on the foam mattress, using my cellular phone as a temporary data hotspot. Melanie had used the internet to destroy my corporate career. I was going to use it to evict her from reality. In supply chain logistics, lost freight does not simply vanish. Every digital transaction, every diverted shipment, leaves a microscopic trail of breadcrumbs. You just have to know how to read the data packets. Melanie had launched her defamation campaign by deploying a viral video. But a video alone does not gain instant traction. It requires an initial surge of engagement to trick the social media algorithms into pushing it to a wider audience. My sister had accomplished this by flooding local community blogs and social platforms with anonymous witness accounts corroborating her fake story of elder abuse. I opened my auditing software. I normally utilized these programs to track rogue shipping vendors across international waters. Today, I aimed them at suburban New Jersey. I began scraping the metadata from the anonymous profiles commenting on the blog posts. Melanie had always needed constant attention since we were teenagers. She routinely fabricated dramatic scenarios in high school just to garner sympathy. Her tactics had not evolved, they had only digitized. She assumed hiding behind a fake username provided unbreachable anonymity. But digital actions require physical hardware. Every post, every comment, and every shared link transmitted a unique IP address. I ran the traceroute functions, watching the green text cascade down my black screen. The data pathways bypassed the standard masking protocols she sloppily attempted to use. The origin points began to cluster. They did not originate from concerned citizens across the state. They all routed back to a single, localized network node. I cross-referenced the Internet Service Provider coordinates with public zoning maps. The cluster sat squarely over a high-rent luxury apartment complex in Hoboken. It was the exact building where my sister leased her penthouse. I dug deeper, isolating the media access control addresses of the transmitting hardware. The timestamps of the anonymous comments matched perfectly with the moments Melanie was actively logged into her primary, verified social media accounts. She was using the same mobile device to play the victim and the anonymous witnesses simultaneously. The math was undeniable. The digital evidence was irrefutable. My sister had manufactured the entire harassment campaign from her living room couch. I exported the network logs, formatted the data into a clean chronological corporate report, and saved it to a secure encrypted drive. I attached the audio file of my father attempting to bribe Hector. I packed my laptop into my bag and stood up. Hector was cutting baseboards in the hallway. I handed him the keys to the shore house. "Lock the doors when you finish, today," I instructed. "I have a meeting in Newark." I spent my last few dollars on a toll pass and a quarter tank of gas. When I walked into Valerie Quinn Law office, I did not bother checking in with the receptionist. I strode directly into her glass-walled suite and dropped the encrypted drive onto her steel desk. Valerie looked up from her paperwork, raising an eyebrow at my disheveled appearance. I had not showered, and plaster dust still clung to my blazer, but I had never felt more powerful. "What is this?" she asked, picking up the small silver drive. "It is the end of their offensive line," I replied, taking a seat across from her. "It contains a high-definition audio recording of Edward offering a $50,000 bribe to my contractor to illegally enter my property. It also contains a comprehensive digital forensic report proving Melanie orchestrated the entire defamation campaign using fabricated identities. She committed cyber harassment and tortious interference with my employment contract." Valerie plugged the drive into her terminal. She spent 10 minutes reviewing the logs and listening to the audio file. A slow, dangerous smile spread across her face. Her eyes gleamed with the thrill of a guaranteed victory. "You built an ironclad trap," Andrea Valerie said, leaning back in her leather chair. "I can draft a civil suit by tomorrow morning. We have them on extortion, bribery, and defamation. We can petition a judge to freeze their remaining domestic assets pending a trial. This stops their harassment permanently." "It neutralizes them," I agreed. "But it does not destroy the root of the problem. A civil suit just forces them to settle. I want the federal trap to close. I want the IRS to obliterate their offshore accounts." Valerie tapped her pen against her desk, the rhythmic sound filling the quiet office. "You are right. This civil evidence protects you, but to detonate the bomb your grandmother left, the federal government needs physical proof of the original pharmaceutical embezzlement. The IRS knows the tax debt exists, but your parents will claim ignorance and drag the audit out for years. If we hand the federal investigators the raw financial ledgers proving the fraud, they will seize everything your parents own in a matter of days. Do you have any idea where those original ledgers might be?" I thought back to the raid at the shore house. The detective had seized the lockbox, but before the police hauled it away, I had stood over the open container. My photographic memory, trained by years of scanning endless shipping manifests, kicked in. I close my eyes, recalling the exact image of the faded paper documents tucked beside the stacks of cash. The random strings of numbers scribbled in the margins of those pages were etched into my mind. I opened my eyes, a new realization dawning on me. Those numbers were not random at all, and I needed to trace their origin before my father realized his mistake. Valerie tapped her polished fingernails against the steel surface of her desk. She picked up her office phone and dialed a contact at the county precinct. The civil lawsuit was drafted and ready to file, but we both understood the limitations of a local judge. A civil injunction would freeze my parents' domestic accounts, but it would not expose the root of their corruption. To trigger a federal investigation, we needed the raw financial data. We needed the exact numbers Edward and Patricia had manipulated to steal from the pharmaceutical company. I told Valerie about the lockbox. I described the faded paper documents tucked beside the decoy cash and the strange alphanumeric sequences written in the margins. The detective had bagged the evidence, but Valerie was a corporate litigator with deep roots in the New Jersey legal system. She called in a favor. 2 hours later, a courier arrived at her office holding a sealed manila envelope. It contained high-resolution, glossy photographs of the evidence inventory. Valerie spread the photographs across her wide desk. The overhead lights caught the shiny surface of the prints. I leaned over the images, studying the pages of the ledger. My grandmother had written the numbers in sharp, precise cursive. There were rows of digits, some containing 13 characters, others containing 14. They were grouped in irregular intervals, accompanied by seemingly random letters. These look like offshore routing digits, Valerie suggested. She picked up a magnifying glass, hovering it over a particularly dense string of text. Or perhaps they are Cayman Island tax haven identifiers. Wealthy embezzlers tend to stick to familiar banking structures. I can run these sequences through a financial tracing database. Valerie turned to her computer terminal and began typing the codes into an encrypted legal search engine. I stood by the window, watching the Newark traffic crawl along the wet pavement below. 10 minutes passed in heavy silence. Then Valerie sighed, leaning back in her leather chair. Nothing, she announced, frustrated. The database rejects the format entirely. These are not standard bank routing numbers. They do not correspond to international wire transfer protocols. They are not even formatted like domestic safety deposit box keys. We are hitting a dead end, Andrea. I walked back to the desk and stared at the glossy photos. The frustration coiled tight in my chest. Edward was currently fighting a forged lien dispute, but his lawyers would eventually maneuver to claim the contents of that lockbox. We were running out of time. I focused all my attention on the jagged string of letters prefixing the numbers. A sudden scent filled my memory. It was not the sterile, recycled air of the law office. It was the sharp aroma of lemon wood polish and roasted pecans. The sterile steel desk faded, replaced by the image of a scarred oak kitchen table. I was 16 years old again. It was a humid July afternoon. Edward was out on a golf course pretending to close deals. Patricia was at the country club, spending money she had not earned. I was sitting in my grandmother's kitchen, drinking iced tea, watching her unroll thick, heavy scrolls of paper. They were pharmaceutical shipping manifests. To a normal teenager, they would have looked like a boring wall of bureaucratic text. But Grandma did not treat me like a child. She treated me like an equal. She handed me a red pen and pulled a chair out beside me. "People lie, Andrea," she had said, her voice steady and commanding. "Paperwork lies. In the corporate world, executives will forge signatures and invent phantom accounts to hide their theft, but freight occupies physical space. A shipping container cannot be hidden in a spreadsheet. Money leaves a physical trail. You just have to know how to read the shipping labels." She had pressed the tip of the red pen against a long barcode at the bottom of the manifest. She taught me how to break down the anatomy of a freight code. She explained the carrier identifiers, the terminal checkpoints, and the destination nodes. She planted the seed of my entire career that afternoon in her kitchen. She guided me toward supply chain management because she knew I possessed the analytical mind to survive it. I blinked, the warm memory dissolving back into the cold reality of the Newark law office. The lesson crystallized in my mind with blinding clarity. My grandmother was a logistics titan. She would never trust a traditional bank to hold her most dangerous secrets. Bankers could be bribed. Vaults could be seized by court order. I snatched the glossy photograph off the desk. I looked at the specific four-letter prefix leading the sequence of numbers. It was a standard carrier alpha code, an identification format used exclusively in commercial freight logistics to track shipping containers across the global supply chain. "These are not bank accounts," I said, my voice echoing loud in the quiet room. Valerie spun around in her chair. "What are they?" "They are bills of lading," I explained, tapping the photograph. "They are specialized tracking coordinates. Grandma did not hide the evidence in a financial institution. She used my exact industry to conceal the proof." I pulled my laptop from my bag, set it on the edge of Valerie's desk, and opened my corporate terminal. My firm had suspended my employment, but my secondary access to the global freight tracking registry remained cached in my offline applications. I typed the alphanumeric sequence from the photograph directly into the search bar and pressed the Enter key. The screen flashed green. The database recognized the format instantly. It was a localized shipping manifest. The digital map zoomed in, highlighting a specific set of geographical coordinates. The tracking icon dropped onto a massive commercial logistics warehouse located in northern New Jersey. It was a highly secure climate-controlled facility utilized by major pharmaceutical corporations to store surplus inventory. Valerie stood up, walking around the desk to look at my screen. "A storage facility?" she asked, her brow furrowing in confusion. Why would she rent a commercial warehouse to hide a few paper ledgers? "She did not rent a warehouse to hide paper," I replied, the sheer magnitude of the situation washing over me. "You do not lease a commercial climate-controlled container for a few folders. You lease that kind of square footage to store physical hardware." My parents had stolen millions over 5 years. That level of theft requires a massive, unalterable digital footprint. Edward thought he had destroyed the corporate servers when the company was sold. He thought he had wiped the hard drives clean. But Grandma had quietly ordered the original physical banking servers transported and sealed inside that container. The lockbox in the wall was not just a decoy. The $400,000 was literal pocket change compared to the devastating digital evidence sitting in that warehouse. "We need to send a subpoena to that facility right now," Valerie said, reaching for her legal pad. "We can petition a federal judge to secure the container before your father realizes his mistake." I shook my head, staring at the corporate logo displayed on the warehouse registry page. "A subpoena takes days to process," I warned her. "By the time a judge signs the order, the facility management will notify the leaseholder. Edward will receive an automated alert. He will hire a private crew to incinerate that container before the federal agents even pull out of their driveway. We cannot rely on the legal system to fetch the weapon. I have to go get it myself." Valerie grabbed my arm. "Andrea, that is a high-security commercial compound. You cannot just walk through the front gate and ask to look inside a private container. You will be arrested for corporate espionage." I pointed at the screen. The warehouse was operated by a subsidiary holding company. It was owned by the exact same logistics firm that employed me. My department director had placed me on unpaid administrative leave yesterday afternoon, demanding I surrender my physical security badge. But I knew the internal corporate bureaucracy better than anyone. The Human Resources Department was notoriously slow. It usually took them 48 hours to push a security update to the remote perimeter access systems. "My physical badge is gone," I told Valerie, shutting my laptop. "But my digital keycard might still be active on the remote servers. I have a tiny window of opportunity before the weekend system reboot purges my credentials. I packed my bag and headed for the door. The real inheritance was not the beach house, and it was not the cash. It was the truth, waiting in the dark. I just had to infiltrate the fortress before the digital gates locked me out forever. The drive north took just under an hour. I kept my headlights low as I approached the industrial park. Northern New Jersey is a sprawling landscape of concrete and steel, a logistics hub that never truly sleeps. But the specific facility I needed sat on the quiet edge of the perimeter, bordered by dark marshland. I parked my sedan 2 blocks away, behind a rusted chain-link fence. I pulled a dark beanie over my hair and hoisted my canvas backpack onto my shoulders. The night air was bitterly cold. I walked toward the rear employee entrance, sticking to the deep shadows cast by the towering security lights. My heart pounded against my ribs in a frantic, uneven rhythm. If the Human Resources Department had processed my suspension paperwork before 5 o'clock, the perimeter system would flag my digital credentials. Security would dispatch a patrol unit within seconds. I reached the steel door. I pulled out my mobile device, opened the corporate authentication application, and held my screen against the biometric scanner. A red light blinked once. The scanner buzzed, processing the encrypted handshake. Time seemed to stop. I held my breath, waiting for the harsh alarm. Then, a soft green light illuminated the panel. The heavy magnetic lock disengaged with a dull click. The system had not purged my access yet. I pulled the door open and slipped inside, letting it shut silently behind me. The interior of the commercial warehouse was vast, resembling a cathedral built for global commerce. Rows of corrugated metal shipping containers stretched upward, stacked 4 levels high, creating narrow canyons of steel. The only illumination came from the dim emergency exit signs and the pale glow of the skylights catching the moonlight. The ventilation system hummed a low, constant drone, masking the sound of my footsteps on the polished concrete floor. I retrieved a small flashlight from my pocket, keeping the beam pointed directly at the ground. I navigated the labyrinth using the geographical coordinates I had memorized in Valerie Quinn Law Office. Aisle 7, Section Echo, Tier 2. My grandmother had chosen this specific location for a reason. It was a climate-controlled sector highly regulated and rarely accessed by standard forklift operators. I turned the final corner and found the unit. A dark blue container sitting flush against the structural support column. I checked the painted identification numbers on the metal doors. They matched the sequence from the photograph perfectly. The heavy steel latches were secured with a numeric padlock. I did not need to guess the combination. My grandmother despised random numbers. She operated on strict logic. I input the founding year of her pharmaceutical company. The brass lock clicked open on the first attempt. I pulled the metal lever down. The right door groaned on its hinges, echoing slightly in the empty aisle. I stepped inside the container and switched on a battery-powered work light mounted near the entrance. The space was not filled with cardboard boxes or forgotten office furniture. It resembled a miniature data center. 3 black steel server racks stood bolted to the reinforced floor. Thick bundles of Ethernet cables snaked between the units, feeding into a standalone power supply and a climate management console. My father believed he had ordered these machines sent to a landfill. He thought he had paid a disposal crew to crush them into scrap metal. He never realized his own mother had outbid him, redirecting the freight to a secure terminal. I unzipped my backpack and pulled out my portable diagnostic terminal. I connected a bridging cable directly into the primary server array. The cooling fans whirred to life, a low mechanical sigh. My screen lit up, displaying the unencrypted root directory. Grandma had removed all the password protections before she sealed the unit. She wanted me to find the truth without any digital barriers. I opened the primary financial ledger. The spreadsheets were vast, detailing thousands of daily transactions spanning 5 years. I applied a basic filtering algorithm, isolating the anomalous routing numbers my parents had utilized to siphon the corporate profits. The data populated on my screen, and the true horror of their operation finally materialized. I had assumed Edward and Patricia were simply skimming excess revenue from private vendors. Corporate theft is common, driven by standard greed. But as I traced the origin of the diverted funds, my blood ran cold. The money was not coming from private contracts. The stolen capital originated from federal Medicare subsidies. My grandmother built a company specializing in distributing critical medications to underfunded state clinics. The federal government subsidized those specific shipments. My parents had systematically fabricated phantom freight invoices, overcharging the federal health programs and pocketing the difference. They had not just stolen from a private corporation. They had robbed a federal healthcare initiative designed to treat vulnerable citizens. This was not a simple civil dispute. It was a monumental federal crime. The penalties for Medicare fraud of this magnitude included decades in federal prison and total asset forfeiture. My parents were not just arrogant thieves, they were federal criminals walking on borrowed time. I needed to extract the physical hard drives. Downloading terabytes of data would take hours, a luxury I did not possess. I grabbed a screwdriver from my bag and knelt beside the primary server rack. I unscrewed the mounting brackets, sliding the heavy rectangular drives out of their metal housings. I packed 4 master drives into the padded compartments of my backpack. I reached for the 5th drive when a subtle shift in the environment made the hairs on my arms stand up. The low hum of the warehouse ventilation was suddenly broken by the distinct squeal of rubber tires on polished concrete. A motorized security cart was rapidly approaching down the main corridor. I froze, dropping the screwdriver. I clicked off my work light, plunging the container into total darkness. Through the crack in the metal doors, I saw the sweeping beams of high-powered halogen flashlights cutting through the shadows. "Check aisle 7, a gruff voice echoed off the steel walls. The perimeter alarm did not trip, but dispatch received a confirmed trespasser report. They gave us the exact sector coordinates. My mind raced. How could security possibly know my exact location within a 1,000,000-square-foot facility? The digital keycard log would only show a general building entry, not a localized tracking ping. My pocket vibrated. I pulled my phone out, shielding the screen glow with my jacket. I had a single new text message from my sister. "Did you really think I would not check the family tracking application?" the message read. "Enjoy the police precinct, you pathetic thief." A sickening wave of realization washed over me. 3 years ago, during a rare family vacation, Patricia had insisted we all download a location sharing application for safety. I had muted the notifications and entirely forgotten the software existed on my device. Melanie, fuming over my refusal to back down, had checked the application. She saw my digital icon sitting motionless inside a restricted commercial logistics zone at 1 in the morning. She had called the facility management and reported an intruder. I was trapped inside a metal box with the evidence of a federal crime sitting in my backpack. If the guards caught me, they would confiscate my bag. Edward would use his corporate lawyers to claim the servers belonged to him, and the evidence would disappear forever. I strapped the heavy canvas backpack tightly across my chest. I could hear the heavy boots of 2 security officers walking down my specific aisle. The sweeping flashlight beams danced across the corrugated metal right outside my door. "She has to be in one of these ground units," the first guard said, his voice less than 20 feet away. I dropped to the floor, crawling toward the rear of the shipping container. I remembered the architectural blueprints of these specific storage models. The back wall featured a small secondary ventilation hatch designed for emergency airflow. I reached the metal panel and fumbled for the release latch in the dark. The mechanism was stiff-rusted from years of disuse. I pushed with all my strength. The latch gave way with a sharp snap. I shoved the square panel outward, creating an opening just wide enough for my shoulders.
Hey!
The second guard yelled. I heard the lock clicking on the front doors. They were opening the unit. I squeezed through the ventilation hatch, twisting my torso to fit the bulky backpack through the narrow gap. I tumbled out the other side, landing hard on my shoulder against the cold concrete of the adjacent aisle. I scrambled to my feet just as the bright halogen lights flooded the interior of the container I had just abandoned. I did not look back. I ran. I sprinted down the narrow canyon of steel containers, my sneakers squeaking faintly against the floor. I ignored the burning in my lungs and the heavy weight of the hard drives bouncing against my ribs. I knew the layout of the facility better than the patrol guards. I bypassed the main corridors, weaving through the tight maintenance pathways. I reached the rear fire exit just as a siren began to wail overhead. The facility was going into full lockdown. I slammed my hands against the crash bar, throwing my entire body weight into the heavy steel door. It burst open, spilling me out into the freezing night air. I kept running across the damp marshland grass until I reached the rusted chain-link fence. I threw my backpack over the top, then climbed the metal mesh, scraping my palms on the rough wire. I dropped onto the pavement next to my parked sedan. I unlocked the car, threw the bag into the passenger seat, and started the engine. I kept the headlights off until I was 3 blocks away, merging onto the empty highway just as 3 local police cruisers sped past me in the opposite direction, their sirens tearing through the quiet night. I drove south, my hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly my knuckles turned white. The adrenaline was slowly fading, replaced by a cold, sharp triumph. My sister thought she had outsmarted me with the tracking application. Instead, she had just handed me the exact motivation I needed to end them. I pulled over at a deserted rest stop and turned off my phone, removing the battery to sever the digital leash. I looked at the dark canvas backpack resting on the seat beside me. My parents had spent the last week trying to break my spirit, using forged documents and internet gossip. They were playing a child game. I now held the undisputed raw data required to put them both in a federal penitentiary for the next 20 years. The defense phase of this war was over. It was time to hand the weapon to the executioner. The Newark skyline glowed pale pink as the morning sun crested the horizon. I walked into Valerie Quinn Law Office before her receptionist even arrived to unlock the front doors. I dropped the heavy canvas backpack onto the polished steel desk. The loud thud echoed in the quiet room. Valerie looked up from her legal pad, her dark eyes shifting from the dirt smudged across my jeans to the exhausted shadows under my eyes. I reached into the canvas sack and pulled out the 4 heavy rectangular hard drives, lining them up side by side on her desk blotter. These contain the unedited financial history of my grandmother pharmaceutical logistics company, I explained, sinking into the leather guest chair. The data traces every diverted federal Medicare dollar directly from the shipping manifests into the offshore accounts controlled by Edward and Patricia. Valerie traced a polished fingernail along the metallic casing of the primary drive. Her expression shifted from professional curiosity to intense, predatory focus. She did not ask how I obtained the hardware. She understood that in corporate warfare, plausible deniability is a required shield. Instead, she picked up her desk phone and dialed her private forensic accountant, ordering him to the office immediately. Television shows portray corporate espionage as a dramatic spectacle, involving flashing computer screens, frantic typing, and custom software viruses. The reality is far more lethal and entirely bureaucratic. I am a supply chain manager. I do not write computer viruses. I deal in physical reality and regulatory compliance. We did not need to hack into my father's banking accounts to ruin him. We simply needed to hand his own, unalterable ledger to the people who regulate the financial system. Within an hour, An independent forensic auditor sat in the conference room, cloning the data drives onto encrypted government-grade servers. The numbers painted an undeniable picture. Edward and Patricia had siphoned federal health subsidies for half a decade. They had defrauded the United States government on a colossal scale. Valerie prepared the official submissions. She compiled a comprehensive dossier for the Internal Revenue Service Criminal Investigation Division. Simultaneously, she drafted an emergency disclosure for the Securities and Exchange Commission Whistleblower Office. She filled out the complex form TCR, attaching my supply chain breakdowns so the federal agents would not have to decipher the raw data themselves. I served them a federal conviction on a silver platter. The beauty of these federal agencies lies in their ruthless efficiency. When presented with undeniable physical proof of systemic federal fraud, they do not send polite warning letters. They act with swift, silent precision. By noon, the submissions were filed over a secure network. The trap snapped shut without a single sound. There is a distinct thrill in dramatic irony. It is the quiet satisfaction of knowing a devastating truth while your enemies operate in total ignorance. As I drank a cup of dark coffee in the law office break room, a federal judge signed an emergency ex parte order. In the span of 30 seconds, every single domestic checking account, offshore trust, and linked credit line belonging to Patricia and Edward froze solid. The federal government locked their wealth inside a digital vault, pending a grand jury indictment. My parents did not receive a phone call. They did not receive an email alert. They were utterly oblivious. 30 miles away, my younger sister was living her usual curated illusion. Melanie parked her leased luxury sport utility vehicle outside an exclusive boutique in Short Hills. She walked through the glass doors, wearing designer sunglasses, expecting the sales associates to fawn over her presence. She spent an hour browsing the racks, carrying a silk blouse and a leather handbag to the marble checkout counter. She pulled out the titanium credit card tied directly to our father's primary wealth management account. She handed the metal card to the cashier with a practiced, haughty smile. She had zero idea that the titanium rectangle in her manicured hand was now nothing more than a useless piece of scrap metal. She did not know her perfect, wealthy existence had evaporated into thin air while she was trying on shoes. I could envision the exact moment the credit terminal beeped red, displaying the harsh decline notification. I could picture the cashier's sympathetic frown, the whispered confusion, and my sister rising indignation as she tried a second card, then a third, only to find every single financial avenue barricaded. Leaving the law office, I drove south along the highway. I rolled the windows down, letting the crisp autumn air clear my lungs. For the first time in a week, the suffocating weight in my chest was gone. I had surrendered my defense. I was no longer the frightened daughter reacting to unexpected attacks. I was the architect of their downfall, sitting comfortably in the stands while the arena burned. I turned onto Ocean Avenue and pulled into the driveway of the Shore House. The property looked fundamentally different in the bright afternoon light. The yellow police tape was gone. The shattered front door had been replaced with a solid, heavy oak entryway. The rotting siding had been stripped away, revealing the sturdy, undamaged structural bones beneath. I walked inside. The harsh smell of damp mold and decay had vanished, replaced by the clean, sharp scent of fresh pine and new drywall. Hector stood in the hallway, wearing a dust mask and operating a power sander. He turned off the machine when he saw me pulling the mask down around his neck. "The foundation is solid," Miss Gill Hector said, wiping his hands on a clean rag. "We reinforced the load-bearing beams this morning. The structural integrity is restored. I can start painting the interior tomorrow." I walked into the master bedroom. The gaping wound in the wall where the decoy lockbox had rested was patched with fresh white plaster. The room felt bright and secure. My grandmother was right. A strong house is not about the paint. It is about what is hidden in the walls and what you are willing to tear down to rebuild it properly. I had torn my own life down to the studs over the past few days. I lost my corporate career, my apartment, and my savings. But looking at the clean, rebuilt walls of the shore house, I realized I had not lost anything of true value. I had merely shed the toxic weight tying me to a family that never truly wanted me. I pulled a thick envelope from my jacket pocket. Valerie had advanced me a small personal loan against the guaranteed whistleblower bounty the federal government awards for exposing Medicare fraud. I handed the envelope to Hector. It contained his full payment for the week, plus a generous bonus for his unyielding loyalty when my father tried to compromise him. "You earned every penny of this," I told him. "Finish the drywall, Hector. Make it beautiful." Hector took the envelope, a silent nod conveying his deep gratitude. He turned the power sander back on, the loud hum filling the restored hallway. I walked out to the back porch and leaned against the wooden railing, watching the gray waves crash against the distant shoreline. The Atlantic Ocean stretched out toward the horizon, vast and indifferent. I closed my eyes and breathed in the salt air. The silence of the trap was deafening. The federal government was currently auditing decades of falsified tax returns. They were tracing the diverted funds through the global banking system. They were preparing the arrest warrants. But the financial freeze would hit my family much faster than the federal agents. A sudden lack of liquid capital triggers an immediate primal panic in people who rely on wealth to demand respect. Edward would try to buy his way out of his forged lien dispute and find his accounts inaccessible. Patricia would try to order her expensive catered lunches and face the humiliation of a declined transaction. The starvation tactics they used to force me out of my apartment were now being applied to them on a federal scale. They were about to experience the exact same terrifying isolation they inflicted upon me. When cornered animals realize they are trapped, they lash out blindly at the nearest target. My phone, freshly charged and reconnected to a new secure network, sat quietly in my pocket. I knew it was only a matter of time before the digital silence shattered. Melanie would not understand the mechanics of a federal freeze. She would only know that her money was gone, and she would blame the one person who refused to fund her lifestyle. She would come looking for me. She would drive down to the shore house, demanding answers, expecting me to cower. I opened my eyes, a cold smile forming on my lips. I wanted her to come. I wanted her to stand in my rebuilt house and realize her power was gone. Because when she arrived, stripped of her fake wealth and desperate for cash, she would bring the final key to my grandmother's true legacy right to my front door. The coastal wind picked up as the afternoon sun dipped lower toward the horizon. I stood by the front window of the shore house, watching the empty street. Hector had packed his tools and left for the day, leaving me alone with the smell of fresh primer and cut pine. The silence inside the newly secured walls felt expansive. I knew the quiet was temporary. A financial freeze does not stay hidden for long. When wealth evaporates, the resulting vacuum creates an undeniable shockwave. I waited for the tremor to reach my front door. The sound of a luxury engine roaring down Ocean Avenue broke the stillness. A pristine white sport utility vehicle careened around the corner, taking the turn far too fast. The tires squealed, kicking up damp gravel as the heavy machine slammed into park across my driveway. My younger sister stepped out. Melanie did not look like the polished socialite who had sneered at me in the Newark law office. Her designer silk blouse was deeply wrinkled. Her oversized sunglasses sat crookedly on her head, tangling in her unkempt blonde hair. Dark streaks of ruined mascara stained the skin beneath her eyes. The carefully curated illusion she presented to the world had fractured. She marched up the wooden steps, her boots striking the planks with frantic, heavy footfalls. She did not bother knocking. She grasped the brass handle and shoved the heavy oak door open, stepping into the refurbished hallway. Her chest heaved with ragged breaths. She scanned the empty living room before locking her erratic gaze onto me. "Where is it?" Melanie demanded. Her voice lacked its usual haughty edge. It sounded raw, strained by pure panic. "Where is what?" I asked, keeping my posture relaxed. I leaned against the window frame, observing her like an auditor reviewing a flawed ledger. "The cash, Andrea. Do not play stupid with me." Melanie closed the distance between us, her hands trembling as she pointed a manicured finger at my face. "I know you kept the rest of the money from the floorboards. I know you hid it. Hand it over, right now." I studied her flushed cheeks and the desperate glint in her eyes. The reality of her situation was written across every frantic gesture. "Tell me what happened at the boutique, Melanie." She flinched. The question pierced her remaining pride. Her jaw tightened, and a fresh tear spilled over her eyelashes, cutting a path through her ruined makeup. "They declined my titanium card," she choked out, her voice breaking. "In front of everyone. The cashier told me to call my institution. I tried 3 different accounts. They all flashed red. I called Dad to fix it, and he was screaming at a bank manager on the other line." She wrapped her arms around her stomach, pacing across the clean hardwood floor. "Dad said his primary accounts are locked. The wealth management firm told him there is a federal hold on his entire portfolio. Mom went to the country club for a charity luncheon, and her platinum card was confiscated at the dining table. The bank told her the accounts do not exist anymore." Melanie stopped pacing and turned toward me, her desperation morphing into irrational anger. "This is your fault. You did this. You hired some shady lawyer to tie up our estate in civil court because you are jealous. You froze our money. Give me the cash from the walls. I need to hire my own attorney. I need to pay my car lease before they impound it." I listened to her unspooling reality. Since childhood, Melanie viewed money as a divine right. When our parents bought her a brand new convertible for her 17th birthday, she threw a tantrum because the leather interior was tan instead of black. She never understood the mechanics of wealth, only the careless spending of it. She assumed a bank account was an infinite well, guaranteed by our father. Now the well was dry, and she possessed zero survival skills to navigate the drought. "I did not freeze your accounts," I stated, keeping my tone perfectly even. "The federal government seized them. Your parents spent the last 5 years siphoning federal health subsidies from Grandma. The Internal Revenue Service is currently dismantling their entire financial existence. There is no cash in the walls. You have nothing left." Melanie stared at me. Her mouth opened, but no words came out. The sheer magnitude of the truth was too heavy for her vanity to process. She shook her head, taking a step backward. "You are lying!" she screamed, the sound echoing harshly off the new drywall. "You are a bitter, pathetic liar. You want me to suffer because you have always been a miserable outcast." She grabbed her own chest, her fingers curling around the thick string of vintage pearls resting against her collarbone. The same pearl she had stolen from our grandmother's bedroom on the morning of the funeral. The necklace was her ultimate trophy, a symbol of her elevated status as the favored child. In her blind, thrashing rage, she weaponized the only valuable item she had left. "You want everything!" Melanie shrieked. "Take this garbage too!" She yanked the necklace with all her fading strength. The thick silk cord snapped. The heavy, vintage pearls flew through the air, striking my chest with a sharp, stinging impact. I did not flinch or raise my hands to protect myself. I stood perfectly still as the round spheres bounced off my jacket and scattered across the hardwood floor. They rolled into corners and settled near the baseboards, filling the room with the hollow sound of dropping beads. Melanie glared at me, her chest heaving. She expected a reaction. She wanted me to yell, to cry, to stoop down and scramble for the jewelry. When I offered nothing but cold silence, her remaining energy evaporated. She let out a frustrated sob, spun on her heel, and ran out the front door. I watched through the window as she threw herself into the driver's seat of her luxury vehicle. She reversed out of the driveway, her tires spinning wildly on the damp road, and sped away toward a life she could no longer afford. The quiet returned to the shore house. I looked down at the floorboards. The scattered pearls gleamed softly in the fading afternoon light. I knelt and began gathering them, dropping the smooth beads into my palm one by one. They felt cool to the touch, carrying the familiar weight of dense nacre. I picked up a cluster still attached to a piece of the broken silk cord. As I sifted through the jewelry, my fingers brushed against a specific pearl resting near the fireplace hearth. I picked it up. My supply chain training involved meticulous quality control inspections. My tactile senses were highly developed from years of handling varied freight materials. The moment the sphere settled into my palm, an alarm bell rang in my mind. This single pearl was different from the rest. It was visibly larger, though, only by a fraction of a millimeter. The surface lacked the natural iridescent luster of genuine marine nacre. It looked slightly dull, bearing a faint artificial yellow discoloration. But the most glaring discrepancy was the density. It felt abnormally heavy, possessing a solid metallic core weight that defied natural organic structure. I walked into the kitchen where Hector had left a canvas tool bag resting on the counter. I set the genuine pearls aside and placed the discolored sphere onto the flat surface of a wooden cutting board. I reached into the bag and retrieved a heavy pair of steel lineman pliers. Grandma never wore costume jewelry. She despised fake items. She was a woman of potent logic and calculated precision. If she possessed an artificial pearl, it served a distinct functional purpose. I positioned the grooved jaws of the steel pliers over the dull sphere. I applied a slow, steady pressure to the handles. The item did not crush into a powdery dust like a natural shell. It yielded with a sharp, brittle crack. The outer casing split cleanly down the center, revealing a hollow interior cavity. I pulled the two halves apart. A tiny, flat black square dropped onto the wooden cutting board. I lowered the pliers, my breathing slowing to a shallow rhythm. Sitting on the scarred wood was a waterproof, micro-secure digital storage card. The puzzle assembled itself in my mind with blinding, beautiful clarity. I had already secured the massive physical servers containing the evidence of the federal fraud. But those servers were merely the ledger of the crime. They were the weapon to destroy my parents. The tiny black square resting on the counter was the prize. It was the encryption key. Before Grandma sold her logistics company, she established a highly secure, untraceable offshore trust. She needed a secure method to store the complex alphanumeric access codes and digital certificates required to unlock those accounts. Storing them on a traditional computer was vulnerable to hacking. Storing them on paper was susceptible to fire or theft. So she utilized her sharpest camouflage. She embedded the digital key inside a fake pearl and strung it into her most cherished necklace. She wore her true wealth around her neck every single day, hiding it in plain sight. A profound wave of realization washed over me, accompanied by a sharp, cutting irony. Melanie had strutted into the law office wearing that necklace to flaunt her superiority. My sister had paraded around the wealthiest boutiques in New Jersey, desperate to project the image of a millionaire. She had cried, screamed, and thrown a tantrum today because her credit cards were declined. She had been wearing the literal key to a multi-million-dollar empire around her neck the entire time. My sister was too blinded by her own vanity to notice the heavy, discolored bead. She valued the superficial appearance of the jewelry over the tangible substance of its owner. Grandma knew exactly how Melanie operated. She knew Melanie would steal the pearls simply to spite me. The necklace was the ultimate safeguard. It kept the encryption key safe from my father's greedy hands by placing it on the one person who would never possess the intellect to examine it closely. I picked up the tiny black storage card, holding it delicately between my thumb and index finger. The sheer brilliance of the trap was awe-inspiring. My parents and my sister had exhausted their energy fighting over decoy cash in the walls and poisoned inheritances in a law office. They had burned their own kingdom to the ground chasing illusions. I slid the digital card into the breast pocket of my jacket, securing it close to my heart. The federal bomb had already detonated, leveling my family financial empire. I no longer needed to worry about their retaliation. They were too busy drowning. Now it was time to finalize the endgame. I needed to let my parents walk blindly into the final snare, using their own unmatched arrogance to seal their fate permanently. The digital encryption key rested safely inside my jacket pocket. I stood in the quiet kitchen of the refurbished shore house, watching the sunlight reflect off the pristine countertops. Hector had finished the primary living spaces. The structure was sound, the walls were solid, and the lingering scent of decay had been entirely eradicated. I poured a glass of cold water and drank it slowly. The board was set. The pieces were in their final positions. I only needed the opposing players to make their mandatory move. My mobile phone began to vibrate against the smooth quartz surface. I glanced at the glowing screen. The caller identification displayed my father. I did not pick it up immediately. I let the device buzz across the counter, counting the rings. Control is often established by controlling the pace of the interaction. On the fifth ring, I tapped the green icon and raised the phone to my ear. I did not offer a greeting. I just listened to the heavy, erratic breathing on the other end of the line. Andrea, Edward said. His voice was tight, frayed at the edges, lacking the booming authority he usually projected in corporate boardrooms. He cleared his throat, attempting to regain his customary arrogant cadence. We need to resolve this unfortunate family dispute. The legal fees are becoming a nuisance for everyone. I leaned against the counter. A nuisance, I repeated. You forged a contractor lien to break into my property. You convinced my landlord to evict me. Your wife and your youngest daughter committed identity theft to drain my savings and launched a coordinated internet smear campaign to ruin my professional career. Those are not nuisances, Edward. Those are felonies. A sharp sigh echoed through the receiver. Patricia was listening on a secondary extension. You are being overly dramatic, Andrea, my mother interjected. Her tone was strained, brittle, like thin ice over a rushing river. We simply took precautionary measures to protect the estate from your mismanagement. But we are willing to offer a truce. We will drop the civil claims. We will instruct Melanie to issue a public retraction regarding your behavior toward your grandmother. In exchange, you will sign the coastal property deed over to us today. We can put this ugly chapter behind us. The desperation was palpable. The federal freeze had paralyzed their liquid assets, leaving them unable to pay their elite legal teams or maintain their lavish daily expenditures. They needed the property to secure a new line of credit, or they needed the phantom cash they firmly believed was still buried inside the walls. They were trying to trade empty promises for a tangible asset. I closed my eyes and engaged the trap. I allowed my shoulders to drop, forcing a deep, trembling sigh into the phone receiver. I adopted the persona of a broken, exhausted woman who had endured too much pressure. I am so tired, I whispered, letting my voice crack perfectly on the final syllable. I cannot fight you anymore. You win. The silence on the line was thick with immediate predatory triumph. I could practically hear Edward smiling. That is a sensible decision, Edward said, his confidence suddenly inflating. I will have my attorney draft the transfer documents. You do not need to draft anything, I interrupted, maintaining the weak, defeated tone. I just want this over. I want you to take what you came for and leave me alone. I found it, Edward. I found the rest of it this morning. The line went dead. Quiet. What did you find? He asked, his voice dropping to a harsh, greedy whisper. The money, I said. I pulled up the ruined floorboards near the fireplace hearth to lay new insulation. There are 3 more metal lockboxes buried in the foundation dust. I have not opened them. I do not want them. Just come get your cash, take the deed, and never contact me again. Edward did not hesitate. His greed bypassed every logical safeguard in his brain. We will be there in 1 hour, he snapped. Do not touch those boxes. The call disconnected. I lowered the phone from my ear. The performance was over. I opened my encrypted contact list and dialed Valerie Quinn. She answered on the first ring. I gave her a brief summary of the conversation. I told her the bait was taken and the targets were in motion. Valerie instructed me to stay put and immediately conferenced in the lead investigator from the federal task force handling the whistleblower claim. The federal agent possessed a calm, clinical demeanor. We discussed the parameters of the impending sting operation. Television dramas often rely on dramatic hostage situations, where the protagonist locks the doors and forces the villain to sign a written confession under the threat of exposure. In the real American judicial system, a forced confession is a useless piece of paper. Any competent defense attorney would have a coerced statement thrown out of court before the preliminary hearing even concluded. I did not want a prolonged legal battle. I wanted a flawless, airtight conviction. To achieve that, the federal agents needed voluntary statements. They needed Edward and Patricia to walk into the room under their own free will and boast about their crimes. They needed to let my parents' immense arrogance become their ultimate undoing. Within 20 minutes, 2 unmarked utility vans pulled onto Ocean Avenue. 6 plainclothes technicians stepped out, carrying heavy black equipment cases. I unlocked the front door and let them inside. They moved with silent, practiced efficiency. The shore house was beautifully renovated. The fresh drywall was seamless, and the new paint smelled clean and bright. It provided the perfect, unassuming stage for a federal snare. The technicians did not drill massive holes or run visible wires. They utilized microscopic audio transmitters, planting the devices deep inside the fresh air returns of the heating system. They tucked secondary receivers behind the newly installed baseboards and nestled a primary directional microphone inside the hollow cavity of the brick fireplace mantel. Every square inch of the living room was transformed into an invisible auditory net. The lead agent handed me a small, discreet panic button disguised as a standard car key fob. He instructed me to press it only if the situation escalated into physical danger. Otherwise, I was to simply keep them talking. Let them explain the origin of the funds, the agent advised, packing his tools. Let them detail the Medicare routing process. The more they brag, the longer their prison sentences will be. The technicians finished their work and retreated to a mobile surveillance vehicle parked 2 streets over, blending in with the coastal neighborhood traffic. They tapped directly into the audio feeds, recording every frequency on secure federal servers. I was alone again. I walked into the kitchen and brewed a fresh pot of dark roast coffee. The mundane task grounded my thoughts. I poured a steaming mug and carried it out to the front porch. I sat down on the top wooden step, wrapping my hands around the warm ceramic. The coastal wind whipped my hair across my face, carrying the sharp scent of salt and imminent rain. I did not feel a single trace of fear. The anxiety that had plagued my childhood, the constant urge to shrink myself to avoid their wrath was entirely gone. I felt the hard outline of the micro-secure digital card resting safely against my chest in my inner pocket. My grandmother had handed me the pieces of a brilliant puzzle, and I had assembled them perfectly. I looked at the restored wooden planks beneath my boots. The foundation was strong. The rot had been excised. The sound of an engine broke my quiet reflection. A dark, luxury sedan turned the corner and sped down the street, braking sharply in front of my property. The vehicle looked pristine, but the people inside it were unraveling. The driver door opened, and Edward stepped out onto the damp pavement. Patricia emerged from the passenger side, clutching a designer handbag tight against her ribs. The rear door swung open, and Melanie climbed out, looking exhausted and frantic. They stood together on the edge of the lawn, a besieged army marching toward a mirage. They thought they were arriving to conquer a weak daughter and reclaim their stolen empire. They had no idea they were stepping onto a federal soundstage. I took a slow sip of my coffee. I stood up, smoothed the front of my jacket, and walked over to the front door. I pulled the heavy oak wide open, gesturing toward the pristine living room. I smiled, a genuine expression of cool, calculated anticipation. "Come right in," I called out to them. "I have been waiting for you." The bitter coastal chill swept into the house as my parents crossed the threshold. The contrast between my meticulously restored property and their deteriorating facade was absolute. The living room smelled of fresh paint and polished pine, a clean sanctuary. My family, however, reeked of desperation and expensive cologne turning sour. Edward wore a bespoke charcoal suit, but the fabric was deeply wrinkled, and his silk tie hung loose around his unbuttoned collar. Patricia clutched her designer handbag so tightly, her knuckles appeared stark white against the dark leather. Melanie trailed behind them, her shoulders slumped, the fiery entitlement from her previous visit entirely extinguished. "Where are they?" Edward demanded. He did not offer a greeting. He did not acknowledge the flawless drywall or the restored structural integrity of the home he had endlessly mocked. His bloodshot eyes darted around the pristine space, hunting for the metal lockboxes I had promised over the phone. I gestured toward the brick fireplace. The primary directional microphone was nestled invisibly inside the hollow mantel, perfectly aligned to capture every syllable spoken in the center of the room. I left them under the floorboards near the hearth, I lied, keeping my voice soft and deliberately defeated. I did not want to touch them. "I just want the deed transfer papers." Edward let out a harsh, barking laugh. He strode toward the fireplace, his leather shoes clicking sharply against the new hardwood. He knelt on the floor, running his hands over the smooth planks, searching for a loose board. "You've finally figured out your place in the food chain, Andrea. It took you long enough." I stood near the kitchen island, resting my hands on the cool quartz counter. "How do you expect to keep that cash hidden from the federal government?" I asked, injecting a perfect note of naive fear into my tone. "The Internal Revenue Service froze your accounts. If you deposit fresh capital, they will seize it immediately." Edward stood up, dusting off his trousers. He looked at me with an expression of profound pity mixed with towering arrogance. "You genuinely know nothing about high-level finance," he sneered. "You shuffle freight manifests for a paycheck and think you understand how the global economy operates? I do not deposit raw currency into a domestic checking account, you fool. I filter it through anonymous shell corporations, just like I did with the pharmaceutical revenue." He was pacing in front of the fireplace, placing himself directly in the optimal recording zone. I needed him to be specific. The federal agents listening in the surveillance van 2 blocks away required granular details to secure the grand jury indictments. "But Grandma caught you," I countered, weakly feeding his massive ego. "She knew you were stealing her profits." "She knew nothing, until the very end," Edward boasted, his chest swelling with misplaced pride. He began to gesture wildly, intoxicated by the sound of his own perceived brilliance. "Your grandmother was a relic. She built a logistics empire but refused to modernize her accounting protocols. It was incredibly simple to outsmart her. She won federal contracts to distribute critical medications to state-funded clinics. The government subsidized those shipments. I simply created phantom logistics vendors. I forged the commercial shipping invoices and billed the Medicare program for freight that never existed. I routed the federal payments into offshore trusts before the company auditors even opened their ledgers. Millions of dollars, Andrea. Invisible, untraceable, and entirely mine." He had just confessed to systemic Medicare fraud on a live federal wiretap. The sheer magnitude of his hubris was breathtaking. He believed he was lecturing a naive, defeated daughter. He had no concept that he was actively dictating his own prison sentence to the Federal Bureau of Investigation. I shifted my gaze to Patricia. She stood rigidly by the front window, nervously twisting the diamond ring on her left hand. "What about the identity theft?" I asked, letting my voice waver. "Edward might secure his cash, but my life is completely ruined. You took every dollar I possessed." My mother let out a sharp, dismissive sigh. "Do not play the victim," she snapped, her cold demeanor returning instantly. "We needed liquid assets to retain our legal counsel because you stubbornly refused to surrender this property. You forced my hand. You walked into a bank branch in Trenton and impersonated me," I said, pressing her for the specific geographical admission. "You stole my savings." Patricia rolled her eyes, annoyed by my persistence. "It was remarkably easy," she admitted, her voice dripping with casual cruelty. "You carelessly left your duplicate state identification card in Melanie Penthouse 3 years ago. I simply handed it to the teller and answered your security questions. I birthed you, Andrea. I know your social security number and your maternal maiden name. You were always too trusting. The teller handed me a cashier check for your entire balance within 10 minutes. Consider it repayment for the stress you have caused this family over the past 2 weeks." I nodded slowly, absorbing her chilling justification. She had effectively confessed to felony identity theft, bank fraud, and grand larceny without a shred of remorse. The audio feed capturing her words was pristine. The trap was holding perfectly. Edward walked over to the kitchen island, pulling a folded legal document from his breast pocket. He slapped the thick paper onto the quartz counter. "This is a quitclaim deed," he stated, tapping the signature line with his index finger. "It transfers sole ownership of this coastal property directly to my holding company. You will sign it, right now." I stared at the document, then looked up at my father. "And what do I get in return for handing over my inheritance?" I asked. Edward smirked, displaying a row of perfectly capped teeth. He believed he held total dominance over the negotiation. "Once I extract the remaining lockboxes from beneath the hearth, I will give you $50,000 in cash," he offered generously. "You can use it to rebuild your pathetic little life. You keep your mouth shut regarding the Medicare subsidies and the bank withdrawal. You walk away, and we never speak again. It is a highly lucrative deal for someone in your desperate position." $50,000. He was attempting to bribe me with a fraction of the decoy cash he firmly believed was buried in my floorboards, demanding I remain silent about millions in stolen federal funds. The absolute absurdity of his proposition was beautiful. I did not argue. I did not raise my voice or attempt to negotiate a higher payout. I simply looked at the three of them standing in my kitchen, Edward radiating smug superiority, Patricia clutching her designer purse like a shield, Melanie staring at the floorboards with hungry, desperate eyes. I let a slow, genuine smile spread across my face. It was a cold, peaceful expression, devoid of any fear or submission. My silent, unwavering smile disrupted the dynamic. Edward expected me to cry, to beg for a larger share, or to sign the paper with trembling hands. My complete lack of anxiety unnerved him. His smirk faltered. He shifted his weight, suddenly hyper-aware of his surroundings. "Sign the paper, Andrea," he demanded, his voice losing its confident resonance. I crossed my arms and leaned back against the refrigerator. "I am not going to sign anything, Edward," I replied calmly. His face flushed a deep, violent crimson. He slammed his fist onto the quartz counter, the impact producing a sharp, cracking sound. "Do not play games with me," he roared, You called us here. You said you were surrendering. I did call you here, I agreed, my tone remaining entirely conversational. But I never said I was surrendering. I said I wanted you to take what you came for. Edward opened his mouth to shout another threat, but the words died in his throat. A strange, unnatural stillness had descended over the property. He slowly turned his head, looking past my mother toward the large front window facing Ocean Avenue. The coastal neighborhood was usually filled with the ambient noise of crying seagulls, distant landscaping equipment, and passing delivery trucks. But the street outside was currently cloaked in an eerie, absolute silence. No vehicles moved. No pedestrians walked along the sidewalks. The normal flow of suburban life had been abruptly severed. Edward stepped closer to the glass, his brow furrowing in confusion. He peered through the window panes, trying to comprehend the sudden emptiness. His arrogant posture dissolved, replaced by the rigid stance of a hunted animal sensing a predator in the brush. He noticed the unmarked black utility vans parked diagonally across the intersections, effectively blocking all traffic from entering or exiting the residential block. Patricia noticed his sudden paralysis. "What is wrong?" she asked, her voice trembling as she followed his gaze toward the window. Edward did not answer her. He stared at the street, his breathing turning shallow and rapid. The realization crashed into his mind with the force of a freight train. He slowly turned around, looking at the seamless drywall, the restored brick fireplace, and finally, my perfectly calm face. He finally understood the magnitude of his mistake. The unusually quiet street was not a coincidence. It was a barricade. The trap had not just snapped shut. The executioners had arrived. The silence hanging over Ocean Avenue shattered without a single siren. Instead of sound, the assault was purely visual. Blinding flashes of crimson and sapphire light suddenly flooded through the front window, painting the pristine walls of my living room in frantic, strobing colors. The shadows of the window panes stretched and warped across the new hardwood floor. Edward stumbled backward, raising a hand to shield his eyes from the overwhelming glare. The heavy oak front door, which I had deliberately left unlocked, swung open with terrifying speed. Federal agents poured into the hallway. They did not shout frantically or wave their weapons recklessly. They moved with a cold, calculated precision that mirrored a perfectly optimized supply chain. Heavy tactical boots struck the floorboards in unison. Black tactical vests bearing bold yellow letters filled the space. State police officers flanked the perimeter, securing the exits. Simultaneously, the sound of the rear kitchen door slamming open echoed through the house as the secondary team breached the back entrance. In less than 5 seconds, the room was entirely saturated with law enforcement. "Nobody move," the lead investigator commanded, his voice projecting easily over the static crackle of police radios. "Keep your hands visible," Melanie shrieked. She backed into the corner near the fireplace, raising her hands trembling above her head. Tears streamed down her face, ruining the last remnants of her makeup. She immediately began shaking her head, distancing herself from the sinking ship. "I did not do anything," she sobbed, her voice cracking. "I do not know anything about Medicare. It was him. It was my father." Edward ignored his youngest daughter and her sudden betrayal. His mind, conditioned by decades of unquestioned authority, simply rejected the reality unfolding around him. He stood in the center of the room, straightening his silk tie in a desperate attempt to project dominance. He looked at the lead agent as if the man were a disobedient employee rather than a federal executioner. "There has been a monumental misunderstanding here," Edward stated, forcing a hollow chuckle. "I am a respected corporate executive. You are raiding a private residence over a simple family disagreement. Whatever my daughter has told you is a fabrication, born from jealousy." The lead agent stepped forward, pulling a pair of heavy steel handcuffs from his tactical belt. "Edward Gill, you are under arrest for conspiracy to commit wire fraud, money laundering, and defrauding a federal healthcare program. Turn around and place your hands behind your back." The color drained from my father, and his face turned pale. The mention of the specific federal charges pierced his armor. The decoy cash hidden in the drywall would have triggered a local investigation, a minor hurdle his high-priced lawyers could navigate. Federal healthcare fraud was an entirely different beast. It meant the investigators had accessed the true ledgers. It meant they knew everything. Edward took a step backward, his eyes darting frantically toward the front door. The escape routes were barricaded by armed officers. The panic finally took hold, overriding his polished veneer. He resorted to the only survival tactic he had ever known. He tried to purchase his freedom. "Listen to me," Edward pleaded, lowering his voice to a conspiratorial whisper, leaning slightly toward the lead agent. "We can resolve this right now. We do not need to involve the federal courts. I have a private offshore trust located in the Cayman Islands. It holds 7 figures in liquid capital. I can authorize a wire transfer to any account you specify within 10 minutes. Name your price. 2 million, 3 million. Just walk out that door and let me handle my family." The sheer magnitude of the dramatic irony was beautiful. I stood silently near the kitchen island watching him attempt to bribe a federal agent using accounts that no longer existed. He was offering phantom numbers. The government had already seized the Cayman Trust hours ago. He was bargaining with ghost money. The agent did not flinch. He did not even blink. He reached out and grabbed my father by the shoulder, spinning him around. "I said, put your hands behind your back." The physical contact shattered Edward and his fragile composure. He possessed a rich man ego, unaccustomed to being touched without permission. He yanked his shoulder away, twisting his torso and throwing a wild, uncoordinated shove toward the agent's chest. "Get your hands off me!" he roared, his face twisting into a mask of pure, untamed rage. The retaliation was swift and decisive. The agent swept Edward and his legs out from under him. My father crashed hard onto the polished hardwood floor he had threatened to destroy just a few days prior. The breath left his lungs in a loud, hollow gasp. 2 officers pinned his shoulders to the ground, pressing his cheek against the smooth pine. The metallic click of the handcuffs ratcheting tight echoed sharply in the quiet room. Edward writhed against the floor, his bespoke suit gathering dust, shouting demands for his attorney that nobody acknowledged. Patricia watched her husband get taken down. The polished, untouchable facade she had maintained for her entire life cracked and disintegrated in an instant. Her knees buckled beneath her. She dropped her designer handbag. The leather purse hit the floor, spilling expensive cosmetics and a gold-plated compact mirror across the wooden planks. She fell to the floor, her silk coat pooling around her legs. She stared at the handcuffs securing Edward, and his wrists, her mouth hanging slightly open in profound shock. The reality of her future settled heavily over her shoulders. The charity luncheons, the country club memberships, and the pristine social standing were gone. They were replaced by the impending reality of a federal holding cell asset forfeiture and undeniable public ruin. A female state trooper approached my mother, grasping her arm and pulling her firmly to her feet. Patricia Gill, the trooper, stated, reciting the Miranda rights in a calm, practiced monotone. "Turn around, please." Patricia did not resist physically. She allowed the trooper to pull her arms behind her back. But as the steel cuffs locked around her delicate wrists, the shock faded, replaced by a deep, venomous hatred. She slowly turned her head, looking past the officers, locking her dark eyes onto mine. The flashing red and blue lights illuminated the stark lines of her face. She saw me standing by the counter, my posture relaxed, my expression calm. She realized I had orchestrated every single detail of this encounter. I had built the snare, set the bait, and locked the doors. "You are no daughter of mine," Patricia spat, her voice trembling with intense hatred. The words were designed to cut, intended to be the final, devastating blow from a mother disowning her child. I looked at her, feeling the cool weight of the micro-digital storage card resting in my jacket pocket. I thought about the pharmaceutical shipping manifests, the encrypted ledgers, and the quiet, fierce intellect of the woman who raised me. I did not feel a trace of sadness. I felt a profound sense of clarity. "I know," I replied, my voice echoing steady and clear across the room. "I am granddaughter." The words struck her like a physical impact. She flinched, looking away from me, unable to maintain eye contact. The officers guided her toward the front door. Another team hauled Edward to his feet, marching him out of the house while he continued to shout hollow threats regarding civil lawsuits. Melanie was escorted out last, sobbing uncontrollably, clutching her ruined silk blouse as the troopers led her into the crisp evening air. I followed them out to the front porch. The coastal fog had thickened, rolling in from the ocean and clinging to the damp pavement. I stood near the wooden railing, my hands tucked deep into my pockets, feeling the smooth, cold surface of a single vintage pearl against my thumb. I watched the state troopers guide my mother down the steps. I watched her dig her designer heels into the wet gravel, twisting around for one final glare before a federal agent placed a hand on her head and guided her into the back seat of a dark cruiser. I watched my father shoved into a separate vehicle, his arrogant profile illuminated by the flashing strobe lights. I watched my sister placed into a third car, her tears offering no protection against the federal charges awaiting her. The heavy doors slammed shut in unison. The engines roared to life. One by one, the cruisers pulled away from the curb, their tires cutting through the damp gravel. The flashing lights slowly faded into the thick fog, shrinking until they disappeared entirely down Ocean Avenue. The physical and emotional threat they had posed my entire life was gone. Their wealth, their manipulation, and their relentless cruelty had been entirely neutralized. They had built an empire on stolen ground, assuming their power made them invincible. But they failed to realize that true power does not reside in stolen cash or designer clothes. True power resides in the meticulous understanding of the system, the patience to track the variables, and the cold, logistical brilliance required to execute the final delivery. I turned around and walked back inside the shore house. The living room was quiet again. The front door closed with a solid, reassuring click. I was standing in a home I had fought to protect, securing a legacy I had earned. The battle was over, but the final reward was still waiting to be claimed. The wheels of federal justice grind with a terrifying mechanical efficiency. 3 days after the raid on Ocean Avenue, I sat in the polished wooden gallery of the federal courthouse in Newark. The room smelled of lemon polish and stale air. Edward and Patricia were escorted through the heavy side door by armed marshals. They did not wear their bespoke suits or cashmere coats. They wore standard-issue khaki detention uniforms. Their wrists and ankles were bound by thick steel chains that clinked loudly against the linoleum floor with every shuffling step. The judge, a stern woman with zero tolerance for white-collar theft, reviewed the preliminary evidence compiled from the logistics servers. The scale of the Medicare fraud staggered the courtroom. The federal prosecutor outlined the flight risks, pointing to the forged passports and the attempted bribery using offshore accounts. Bail was denied without a second of hesitation. The gavel fell with a sharp wooden crack. My parents were remanded to federal custody pending trial. Edward slumped forward, the remaining color draining from his face until his skin looked like ash. Patricia stared blankly at the defense table, her carefully constructed reality entirely shattered. They were going to a federal penitentiary. I watched them shuffle back out the side door, feeling only a profound, quiet detachment. The ghosts of my childhood were finally exorcised. Melanie managed to secure a conditional release. The federal prosecutor viewed her as a peripheral beneficiary rather than a criminal mastermind. A local bondsman accepted the last of her hidden designer watches as collateral for her freedom. She walked out of the courthouse, blinking against the harsh afternoon sunlight, clutching her personal belongings in a clear plastic bag. She did not look at me. She hailed a taxi, desperate to return to her luxury penthouse in Hoboken. She believed she could salvage her digital empire. She assumed her online followers would provide a safety net, a shield against the crushing legal and financial reality closing in around her. The next morning, I sat at the kitchen island of the shore house, drinking dark coffee and monitoring the digital fallout. Melanie activated a live video stream on her primary social media account. I clicked the notification, watching her face fill my laptop screen. She had positioned her ring light perfectly, illuminating her tear-streaked cheeks to maximize the dramatic effect. She wore a simple white blouse, adopting the persona of a fragile, innocent victim caught in a crossfire. "I am sharing my truth today," Melanie sobbed, staring directly into her phone camera. "My parents hid their crimes from me. My sister orchestrated a cruel setup to ruin our family and steal my inheritance. I am sharing my truth today," Melanie sobbed, staring directly into her phone camera. "My parents hid their crimes from me. My sister orchestrated a cruel setup to ruin our family and steal my inheritance. I am entirely alone, and I need your support to rebuild my life." The digital audience responded with a flood of sympathetic comments and floating heart icons. Then the poetic justice arrived unscripted. A loud, persistent pounding echoed in the background of her video feed. Melanie ignored it, continuing her tearful monologue about survival and betrayal. The pounding escalated into a heavy, forceful thud. The door to her penthouse swung open. Two large men wearing dark work uniforms stepped into the frame, followed closely by the building property manager holding a master key. Melanie froze, her eyes widening in genuine terror. "What are you doing in my apartment?" she shrieked, breaking her fragile character. The lead worker produced a thick metal clipboard. "Ma'am, we represent the Asset Recovery Division for your primary creditors. The accounts linked to your auto lease and luxury credit lines have been frozen under a federal fraud investigation. We possess a court order to seize all collateral purchased with those specific funds." Melanie scrambled backward, knocking her expensive ring light askew. "You cannot do this!" she screamed, waving her hands frantically. "I am broadcasting live! Get out of my home!" The camera angle tilted, capturing the chaos with ruthless clarity. The workers ignored her protests. One man walked over to her open closet and began pulling armfuls of designer handbags, silk dresses, and expensive leather coats, dropping them roughly into large, heavy-duty canvas bags. The second man held up a set of electronic car keys he found resting on the kitchen counter. "The tow truck is hooking up the sport utility vehicle downstairs right now," he announced, over his shoulder radio. The live chat beside the video feed exploded. The previous sympathy transformed instantly into brutal, relentless mockery. Her followers watched in real time as the repo men dismantled her curated existence. Melanie lunged for her phone, her manicured hand covering the lens, but the audio continued, broadcasting her hysterical sobbing as the workers stripped her apartment bare of every status symbol she owned. The stream abruptly ended, leaving a dead black screen. The golden child had built her entire life on a foundation of stolen vanity. I watched it collapse on a digital stage, sipping my coffee, feeling the deep satisfaction of a closed loop. Severing the financial and legal ties was a victory, but it was not enough. I needed to sever the bloodline. A week later, I walked into the county civil court. I stood before a municipal judge and submitted my formal petition for a legal name change. The judge reviewed the attached federal indictments regarding my parents understanding my undeniable need for distance from their toxic legacy. He signed the order without a single objection. I walked out of the building holding a freshly stamped legal certificate. I was no longer Andrea Gill. I dropped the surname that carried decades of manipulation and neglect. I legally adopted my grandmother's maiden name. I became Andrea Palmer. The transformation felt like shedding a heavy, suffocating skin. I was finally breathing my own air. The swift resolution of the federal raid sent shockwaves through the New Jersey corporate sector. My logistics firm quickly realized the gravity of my actions. I did not just survive a family scandal. I had exposed a monumental vulnerability in the regional supply chain and handed the federal government a flawless whistleblower case. My former department director, the man who had coldly stripped me of my security badge, requested a meeting at a high-end coffee shop near the corporate campus. He sat across from me, looking deeply uncomfortable in his tailored suit, a thin layer of sweat forming on his forehead. "Andrea," he began, clearing his throat nervously, "the board of directors reviewed your file. We recognize that you acted with extraordinary integrity under immense personal pressure. We want to issue a formal apology for your suspension." I stirred my tea, waiting for the inevitable transaction. "We want you back," he continued, sliding a thick, glossy folder across the table. "We are offering you a senior director position. It includes a substantial salary increase, full back pay, and complete control over the Eastern Seaboard Compliance Division. You proved you can handle high-stakes crises. We need that intellect on our leadership team." I looked at the folder. A month ago, this offer would have represented the pinnacle of my professional ambitions. I had spent my entire adult life striving for corporate validation, seeking approval from authority figures to fill the void my parents created. But standing in the gutted shore house, sleeping on a freezing floor, and fighting a war on my own terms had fundamentally rewired my brain. I no longer needed their validation to prove my worth. I slid the folder back across the table. "I appreciate the offer," I said, keeping my tone polite but firm. "However, I must decline." The director blinked, his professional composure slipping. "You are turning down a senior directorship? Where else are you going to find this kind of compensation?" "I am not looking for a new employer," I replied, standing up and buttoning my coat. "I am building my own firm. I suggest you review your vendor compliance protocols carefully. When my logistics consultancy opens next month, I will be auditing your competitors, and I am highly proficient at finding structural weaknesses." I walked out of the coffee shop, leaving him speechless at the table, his coffee turning cold. I drove back to the shore house. The property stood tall against the coastal wind, its fresh white siding gleaming in the afternoon sun. I had defended this ground. I had rebuilt the walls, cleared the debts, and banished the ghosts that haunted my past. I walked into the quiet kitchen and retrieved my laptop from the counter. I reached into my jacket pocket and pulled out the tiny waterproof micro-storage card I had extracted from the fake Pearl. The legal fallout was settled. The toxic family ties were severed. The enemies were locked away. It was finally time to discover the true legacy my grandmother had hidden away from me. The late afternoon sun cast long golden shadows across the quartz countertop of my quiet kitchen. I sat on a wooden stool, staring at the tiny black square resting on the polished surface. The waterproof micro-storage card looked incredibly fragile. It was smaller than my thumbnail, a thin chip of silicone and plastic that had survived, concealed inside a hollow artificial pearl. My heart beat with a steady, rhythmic anticipation. I retrieved a small digital media adapter from my laptop bag, slid the memory card into the narrow slot, and plugged the device into the side port of my computer. The screen flickered for a fraction of a second. A sharp chime echoed through the silent room. Instead of opening a standard file directory, my operating system launched a secure command prompt. A solid black window appeared, displaying a single line of blinking white text requesting a 32-character alphanumeric decryption key. My grandmother left nothing to chance. Anyone who managed to steal the necklace, discover the hidden compartment, and extract the memory card would still face an impenetrable digital wall. The encryption protocol was military grade. I leaned forward, resting my elbows on the counter. I did not panic. I knew she had provided the key. I just needed to access the correct memory. I thought back to the humid summer afternoons on the front porch, learning how to decipher freight codes. I thought about the fake passports in the decoy lockbox. I thought about the specific tracking sequence that led me to the warehouse servers. I placed my fingers on the keyboard. I typed the 4-letter commercial freight prefix she had taught me. I followed it with the precise longitudinal and latitudinal coordinates of the shore house, concluding the sequence with the founding date of her original pharmaceutical company. I pressed the enter key. The screen hung suspended in black for 3 agonizing seconds. Then the command prompt dissolved. A single folder materialized on my desktop. The label simply read, Legacy. I clicked the icon. The folder expanded, populating the screen with hundreds of digitized legal documents. There were trust incorporation certificates, federal tax receipts, and certified property appraisals. I opened the master financial ledger, assuming I would find a modest liquid mutual fund. I expected a sensible portfolio containing perhaps a few $100,000, a practical safety net designed to cover my property taxes and fund my basic living expenses while I searched for a new job. I scrolled past the localized operating accounts, pulling the digital spreadsheet down to the final line item. The total portfolio valuation loaded in bold black digits. $8.5 million. I gasped, the sound catching sharply in my throat. I pushed my chair back, my eyes locked on the impossible figure. I rubbed my temples, convinced I was misreading a decimal point or looking at an outdated corporate valuation. But the date on the ledger was current. The math was flawless. I leaned back over the screen, analyzing the asset columns to understand how she had accumulated such staggering wealth under the radar. As my eyes scanned the itemized entries, the true brilliance of her design unfolded. The $8.5 million was not liquid cash sitting dormant in an offshore bank account. It was not bound in volatile stock market index funds. Every single dollar was anchored in physical commercial real estate. My grandmother had quietly taken her clean, legitimate profits from the sale of her pharmaceutical company and funneled them into a private holding corporation. She used that corporation to purchase 5 sprawling industrial logistics centers located along the prime shipping corridors of the New Jersey Turnpike. I opened the attached property deeds, reading the specific municipal addresses. A profound, breathless laugh escaped my lips. I knew these exact addresses. I had spent the last 5 years auditing the freight traffic moving in and out of these specific facilities. These were the high-security, climate-controlled warehouses utilized by the most powerful supply chain firms in the Northeast. These were the exact distribution hubs leased by my former employer. My grandmother did not just leave me a pile of money. She understood my brain. She knew my expertise. She watched me build a career in supply chain management, and she engineered a kingdom tailored specifically to my unique skills. She bought the critical infrastructure of the industry. She did not just hand me wealth, she handed me a turnkey commercial empire. She made me the legal landlord of the very corporate directors who had cowardly stripped me of my security badge. I closed the laptop, the soft click of the lid echoing in the pristine kitchen. I walked out to the restored front porch and leaned against the sturdy wooden railing. The sun was dipping below the horizon, painting the coastal clouds in brilliant shades of violet and bruised orange. The poetic justice of the entire ordeal settled over me, wrapping around my shoulders like a heavy, warm blanket. Edward and Patricia had spent their lives viewing my grandmother as a financial liability. They treated her like a burdensome obstacle standing between them and their unearned luxury. They stole her profits because they believed they were entitled to the spoils of her labor. Now the people who viewed my grandmother as a burden were locked inside a federal penitentiary. They were stripped of their designer wardrobes, their platinum watches, and their country club memberships. They slept on thin mattresses over concrete floors, wearing identical khaki uniforms, surviving on terrible food provided by the government. They had become the ultimate, literal burdens of the state. They would spend the next 2 decades trapped in a cage of their own making. My sister, the golden child, who had weaponized her vanity to destroy my reputation, was now a public cautionary tale. Melanie had declared bankruptcy. The internet, a notoriously unforgiving arena, had archived her humiliating live broadcast. Her digital influence evaporated. She was forced to abandon her expensive urban lifestyle and find minimum wage employment in a retail stockroom, spending her days unpacking the same luxury garments she used to flaunt on camera. And I, the discarded daughter, the quiet girl who was told to accept the scraps and shrink into the background, was standing on the porch of a paid-off coastal estate, holding the keys to a multi-million-dollar logistics empire. 1 year later, the New Jersey autumn returned, bringing crisp morning winds and bright, cloudless skies. I woke up early, stepping out of my warm bed and walking across the smooth hardwood floors of the shore house. The property was fully furnished now, decorated with sturdy, elegant pieces that felt permanent and secure. I walked into the kitchen and turned on the espresso machine, listening to the comforting hum of the water boiler. My new logistics consulting firm was thriving. I operated the business out of a sleek, modern office suite in downtown Newark, but I always spent my weekends here anchored to the coast. I had spent the past 12 months analyzing the leases for my commercial warehouses, renegotiating the contracts with ruthless efficiency. When the renewal agreement crossed the desk of my former department director, he was forced to sign a check bearing my new legal name, paying me a premium to keep his freight moving. I poured the dark, rich espresso into a ceramic mug and wrapped a thick wool cardigan over my shoulders. I unlocked the heavy front door and stepped out onto the porch. The hydrangeas I had planted in the front beds were blooming in vibrant shades of blue and purple. Their roots had grown deep and strong, holding the sandy soil firmly in place, protecting the foundation from the harsh coastal storms. The house stood proud and unyielding against the ocean breeze. I leaned against the railing, taking a slow sip of the hot coffee. The bitter, complex flavor grounded my senses. I looked out toward the gray Atlantic Ocean, watching the whitecaps roll and break against the distant shoreline. The sound of the crashing waves was a constant, powerful rhythm, drowning out the noise of the past. I did not feel angry anymore. I did not feel the lingering sting of betrayal or the heavy weight of my childhood isolation. I had excised the rot fortified the walls and claimed the legacy I was meant to inherit. I stood on my own property, built by my own intellect, surrounded by an unshakable peace. I breathed in the sharp, salty air, smiled at the rising sun, and knew that my foundation would never crack again. There is a distinct, lingering scent that clings to a house suffering from rot. It isn't just the smell of damp wood or failing plaster. It is the scent of neglected responsibilities of decay that was ignored because looking at it was simply too inconvenient. When we reflect on the collapse of the Gill family, the true tragedy was never the federal indictments, the frozen bank accounts, or the seized luxury vehicles. The tragedy was the hollow foundation upon which two parents attempted to build a legacy, sacrificing their children on the altar of their own greed. In American culture, we are frequently sold a sterilized, heavily curated version of the family dream. We are taught that success is measured by the zip code of our real estate, the crest on our vehicles, and the seamless, smiling holiday portraits we broadcast to our peers. Edward and Patricia Gill were disciples of this glittering illusion. They believed that wealth was a substitute for character, and that maintaining a pristine social facade absolved them of the gritty, unglamorous work of actual parenting. But parenting is not a financial transaction. It is an emotional contract, a daily commitment to honesty, fairness, and the cultivation of a child's internal moral compass. When parents replace emotional awareness with material indulgence, they do not create strong children. They create fragile glass sculptures waiting to be shattered by the real world. Look at Melanie, the golden child. For 27 years, she was shielded from consequences, handed vintage pearls and luxury leases instead of boundaries and accountability. Society often pities the discarded child, the one who is mocked and marginalized, but the most insidious form of child abuse is raising a human being to be completely incapable of surviving their own failures. Melanie's parents weaponized her vanity, effectively crippling her intellect and her resilience. When the federal freeze hit, she didn't just lose her money. She lost the only identity her parents had ever bothered to help her build. Conversely, the child deemed a burden, the one left to sleep on a freezing mattress in a gutted house, is often the only one forced to learn the architecture of survival. Andrea was denied the easy comfort of her parents' stolen wealth. Instead, she was gifted something far more valuable by her grandmother: the cold, unyielding truth. Sitting at a scarred oak kitchen table, learning to read supply chain manifests, Andrea was taught that money leaves a trail, that actions have consequences, and that a strong house is defined entirely by what is hidden in the walls. Her grandmother understood that long-term guidance is not about shielding children from the harsh realities of the world. It is about equipping them with the analytical and emotional tools necessary to dismantle corruption. This brings us to a profound crisis of values in modern parenting. We obsess over passing down generational wealth, establishing trusts, and securing admission to elite universities. Yet we so frequently fail to pass down generational integrity. Honesty and fairness are not simply moral suggestions. They are the load-bearing pillars of any healthy family structure. When parents lie, embezzle, and exploit, they introduce a systemic rot into the bloodline. They teach their children that love is conditional, that loyalty is for sale, and that vulnerability is a weakness to be exploited. To raise a child within a traditional family structure requires the courage to be emotionally transparent. It requires a mother and a father to admit their flaws, to enforce fair consequences, and to demonstrate that doing the right thing is rarely the easiest path. The Gill family collapsed because it lacked this fundamental emotional awareness. They operated on a doctrine of supreme selfishness, cannibalizing their own matriarch and discarding their eldest daughter simply because she refused to be blind to their decay. If you have ever found yourself standing in the ruins of a family that was supposed to protect you, if you have ever had to become your own architect to survive the people who shared your name, you are not alone. There is a profound, quiet strength in recognizing the rot and choosing to walk away. For more narratives that explore the complex, often hidden dynamics of family survival and justice, be sure to follow Amanda Told Stories. We share these journeys because sometimes hearing another person's truth is the exact blueprint you need to rebuild your own life. Society conditions us to believe a very specific, deeply ingrained narrative about family. We are told that blood is thicker than water. We are commanded to forgive our parents, to honor them simply because they gave us life, and to preserve the family unit at all costs, regardless of the emotional toll. We are taught that walking away from our bloodline is an act of supreme selfishness, a betrayal of the natural order. But I offer a different, perhaps unsettling truth. Sometimes the most profound act of love and responsibility you can perform for your family is to let the illusion burn to the ground. We are conditioned to believe that unwavering loyalty is a virtue. But loyalty to a corrupted system is just slow suicide. There is no nobility in allowing yourself to be consumed by the greed, manipulation, and vanity of the people who were supposed to be your sanctuary. True family responsibility does not mean sinking with the ship out of a misplaced sense of duty. It means having the devastating courage to step off the vessel to light the match, and to watch the rot sink beneath the waves. It means recognizing that the title of mother or father is not a blank check for abuse, and that forgiveness without changed behavior is just giving your abuser permission to strike again. Andrea did not destroy her family. She simply stopped protecting them from the mathematics of their own choices. She stripped away the drywall and exposed the rotting studs for the world to see. In doing so, she broke a generational curse. We spend our entire lives searching for the perfect foundation, desperate to belong to a home that makes us feel safe, valued, and understood. But perhaps safety is not something you are inherently born into. Perhaps it is something you must ruthlessly construct from the wreckage of your own profound disappointments. When you finally stand in the quiet aftermath, looking out at the ocean from a porch you built with your own hands, you are left with a haunting realization. The strongest, most unbreakable houses in this world are not built on perfectly manicured lawns or pristine inherited estates. They are built squarely on the graves of the families we had the strength to leave behind.